I think we're coming
So,
on.
good evening. This is Lyle Baker. I'm the chair of the meeting, but I'm remote. So I asked John Oliver, the vice chair, to function as the chair in the room because he can see and hear much better than I can and make sure that everybody gets to participate the way they should. So I'm just going to indicate that I'm going to turn everything from here on over to John to run and be very grateful to him for taking on that responsibility. And I'll just raise my hand like everybody else when the time comes. So thank you, John.
My pleasure, Chair Baker. So I wondered, we've got 1, 2, 3, yes, there's only 4 members of the committee, which I suppose that means we can start.
Yeah.
So, okay, and we know we're not gonna see Vicky.
Yes.
Have we heard from Josh by any chance? Anybody else? Raina?
There she is.
All right, well, I guess there's no real need to wait because I don't know what's up with Josh, but or Councilor Krinsman. But just a couple of housekeeping issues. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Zoning and Planning Committee. It is October the 10th. We are being audio and video recorded. With me at the beginning of the call, our councilors Getz, myself, Councilor Oliver, we have Councilor Albright, and online we have Councilors Baker, Wright, Lipoff, and that is it, at least for now. So fantastic. With that said, we've got a fair number of items on our agenda tonight. So I'm going to try and get through everything in a reasonable pace. He said without laughing. But so the first 2 items we're hoping to get on the schedule for public hearings. Without further ado, I'll read in item 311-24, requesting discussion and possible amendments to dormer regulations in chapter 30 zoning. And I believe I'm turning this over to either Nora or Jen. Great. Take it away.
Thank you. And let me just share my screen with our presentation. And so this first item is looking at what we think is a small change to how we regulate dormers currently. Get this out of the way. So first, just very brief primer, what is a dormer? So this is the projections you see on the pitched part of the upper story of roofs, typically homes, residential buildings that projects out with windows. And how we regulate dormers today, we regulate them in a number of ways, but the kind of key piece that we're looking to update is this one, where a dormer may be no wider than 50% of the length of the exterior wall of the story below. Where more than one dormer is located on the same side, the width of all dormers combined may not exceed 50% of the length of the exterior wall next below. So this is fine. However, the interpretation over time has been that a wall is anytime there's a change in plane. So anytime there's a projection, there's bay windows that are projecting, there's some sort of just change in plane on the wall below, that's a new wall. So that makes it tough to meet what we think is the intent of this requirement, and you can end up getting some funky things. So just to illustrate, here's something, taking a look at this example below, where we have the red vertical lines on the bottom 2 stories would represent what would be considered different walls under this interpretation. So each of these are a slightly different plane, mainly because the middle with the windows projects out a bit. So you have 3 walls below, and the dormers couldn't be more than 50% of any one of those, and needs to be centered over them. So if you wanted to provide dormers here, you end up with kind of funny things that may not make sense.
Small, funny.
Small, kind of oddly placed dormers. So this example here would not be allowed because this isn't centered over any one sort of plane below and would exceed 50% of any one plane. So there's additional limitations on dormers. So this is sort of regulating a bit more of the aesthetics of dormers. We also require that they be fully above the roof line and that they be set in 3 feet from either edge of the building. But what's also regulating dormers is our half-story definition, and so this determines when a half-story, so the area under a pitched roof, becomes a full story. And most of our residential zoning districts allow 2.5 stories by right and 3 by special permit. And if you have too much dormer space, you end up with, you tip yourself into a full story from a half story because you have more area under that roof that's 7 feet or greater. So that's sort of providing an additional backstop on the use of dormers. What we're proposing is simple change, just that the dormer may be no wider than 50% of the uninterrupted roof plane, so that you're looking at the roof line rather than any wall planes below it. We came up with this language in working closely with the Commissioner of Inspectional Services, as well as our chief zoning code official. We think this gets more at the intent and is a relatively simple change. So this is what we're hoping the committee will set a public hearing for this change.
Fabulous, thank you. Councilor Baker and then Councilor Getz.
So thank you. I think there's an error in just a spelling. I think the last word in the slide before should be plain rather than plan.
That is correct. Thank you.
Oh, no, so,
Yes.
but I think that the idea, just a little historical background, the reason this original provision, this particular provision came about was that we were seeing dormers basically substituting as a kind of a third floor without being a third floor. And they were taking over more of the space, and visually we were trying to keep it below 50%. Sort of remember our discussion about garages in the same way, to make it a less dominant feature. And the only question I have is that in the process of making this change, which I think is much simpler to administer, whether the number should be slightly lower than 50, just to make sure that you're taking account of the fact that visually you've got overhanging eaves that can count in the distance. In the current arrangement, you just count from wall plane to wall plane, as I understand it, as opposed to from roof line to roof line, and the roof line can extend with eaves, some distance beyond either side. And it would be an anomaly to me that we would end up in back where we were before, where the dormer looked like a more important visual piece of the property rather than a secondary piece. So that's the one question I have in terms of the actual proposal.
Great, thank you. Councilor Getz.
The only other thing is language change within the ordinance itself, so that you will actually then go back and adjust what's the existing dormer, in terms of, in the actual ordinance. The definition of the dormer.
Yeah.
That's where it's gonna live.
Yes.
So we didn't see it as in the memo, but that's, just in terms of referring it back to the definition will change, and that would be the only.
Yes, that's the only change we're proposing. We're not proposing any other changes. We didn't provide a red line ordinance. I think this is such a simple one. It's just taking the existing definition and substituting uninterrupted roof plane for the wall plane next below.
Right, so I'm just,
Yeah.
being in the current ordinance, just reading all the polls of dormer, it's gonna be then corrected in all of those places.
Yes.
Okay.
Great, Councilor Wright.
Councilor Baker brought up a good issue where you do have the overhang, and I think in general the overhang is about 1 foot, so you would have 2 extra feet on each side. And what is a typical width of a roof line?
I mean, that varies significantly depending on the size of the home. I mean, I think that's a pretty small difference. You're still, like I said, you're still limited by triggering that 3rd story so that it won't turn into a full 3rd story without needing a special permit. So I think that's personally, I think that's minor enough that it makes sense to stick to the 50%. But I don't have a typical roof plane.
So let's say, just simple math, let's say a house is 40 feet long, and then you have which includes the foot on each side, so that's 2 feet out of 40, which is about 5%. When you're talking about numbers of 5%, that's starting to get up there, I think. I don't know if that number should be 45% then instead of the 50%? Or will how we talk about a third story catch anything that's too big?
I mean, I think the third story will catch things. You still have to be set 3 feet in from the walls below. You're not ever gonna.
Okay,
So the dormers won't ever be able to extend to the end of those overhangs, and you're limited to sort of where you can fit them. We also, I mean, dormer special permits are also pretty frequent and generally granted. So I would think even if you were giving just a tiny bit extra dormer space, it's not out of line with what's already happening.
okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Councilor Albright?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think that this is perfectly reasonable. And 50%, well, there was nothing magical about the number 50% in the first place. It was just a way to solve a problem. And so if it went to 52%, 53%, I don't think it would kill anybody. So I'm happy to send this to public hearing.
Councilor Baker, your hand's up again?
Yeah, just a quick question. Again, I think we should send it to public hearing. I guess that the opportunity for the public hearing is just to play out some of these scenarios a little more clearly and make a judgment and adjustments. And I understand that we could make an adjustment from 50% to some lesser number if we wanted to, and we may not. We may want to, but I think that part of the analysis that would be helpful for the public hearing is to have Ms. Kyra do the kind of visually what she's described orally, which is the impact of the third story as a check on the resulting size. The basic point here is we're trying to make this a 2.5-story building, still not a 3-story building, by just changing the dormer rules. And but the simplicity of this is certainly admirable. So, but my understanding is we have the ability to modify the proposal to some degree, even if the public hearing is set. That unless the law department tells otherwise, I assume that's our standard practice. Mr. Lee?
The public hearing language is going to be broad enough that if there are additional changes with regards to subject matter, it won't be an issue.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Thank you, sir. Just one quick question, I guess, from uninterrupted roof. In my head, I get an image of what that is. Is that is there anything else to that? What is that? If you just said roof line or roof, what's the difference, I guess? What is an uninterrupted roof excluding, I guess, might be one way to look at it.
Yeah, so I think it would primarily be excluding when you have like a change in sort of pitch or, additional sort of roof lines that intersect. We can take a closer look. This was the language recommended by the commissioner. And he recommended uninterrupted roof plane, but we can take a closer look to see if roof or roof line.
It's more of a point of curiosity because the word was added. It's like, okay, I get uninterrupted, but I didn't know if it had an additional meaning beyond that. Okay, thank you. Councilor Getz, are you all set? And Councilor Kalis, I saw your hand up, but you're all set as well, sir?
All set.
All right, fantastic. I think I heard a motion from Councilor Albright to set the public hearing for Thursday, November the 14th. So I guess we'll put that to a vote. I don't think we need to second that. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed or any opposed? Great, that passes unanimously. I believe that's 6-0.
Yes, 6-0. The item's held and the public hearing is set.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for the correction. Moving along to item 317-24. Requesting discussion and possible amendments to section 5.4.2. This has to do with retaining walls. You know, an ordinance that was just passed relatively recently by the city council. And again, I believe, Ms. Kyra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just pull up this presentation. So that's right, this is an amendment to a fairly recent amendment. Computer will stop freezing. Oh, there we go. Okay, so earlier this year, we amended the retaining wall ordinance to now require a special permit anytime a retaining wall is over 4 feet in height, as opposed to when it was over 4 feet in height just within the setback, which was the prior requirement. So we realized afterwards that this is a problem for mainly multifamily and mixed use or some commercial development that generally have underground garages, which we want to see. We prefer the parking be underground. This change was made mostly in response to residential properties, single family, two family, single family attached, that were using a number of retaining walls to change the grade of the site, that may put large retaining walls to get a flat yard, that sort of thing. This then was also flagged recently, and we put this in a memo that went in the packet Friday as well, by the state in the review of our village center zoning for MBTA compliance. They also saw this as something that could prevent by right development. And I'll show you some examples of what this typically looks like. So for even relatively small multifamily development, we often see an underground garage. Sometimes you're going straight into it from the street, right at the front of the building, and sometimes it's a longer driveway along the side of the building and then sort of turning to get into the garage. Generally, by the end of that ramp into the garage, you may have walls more than 4 feet. However, they tend not to be above grade. So they're still sort of sunk down. They're not doing the thing we were trying to prevent. Another example, this, headed straight back into a garage. You see this even at Austin Street to get down to the residential parking in that garage. So what we're proposing is that we keep the current requirement, special permit for retaining walls over 4 feet for all single family detached, two family detached, and single family attached building types, which is where we tend to see more of the grade manipulation. And then for all other building types, multifamily, commercial, industrial, we return to the previous regulations and only regulate the retaining walls within the setback. And like I said, this is important for our MBTA community's compliance as well. So again, we're hoping to set a public hearing for this item for next month as well.
Great. Councilor Wright?
Thank you, Chair. So I first want to start to say I support making by right underground parking retaining walls. I don't know if they should maybe be a foot off the lot line or something like that, but that's something we can discuss. I just wanted to say one thing that kind of irritates me is the MBTA flagged this as something that is an issue, and they told us we could not count underground parking as part of our calculations, and their calculations does not include underground parking, but actually surface parking, and this was all by right. So it just irritates me that they're calling this out, which in their calculations and everything else, this doesn't come into the calculations at all. But anyways, I would not want to see just to let retaining walls on multifamily lots, just like we don't want to see it on single family lots where they're building up the lot or extending the lot and building it up. I'd like to narrow it for by right for parking, underground parking. And then I think we need a discussion, because I worry more about the support and things like that, having it right on the lot line. Maybe it needs to come off a foot off the lot line or something like that. But I don't think we should just open it up for any of that, for any retaining walls for those type of properties. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Counselor. Counselor Baker.
So I'm just gonna say, I agree with Counselor Wright.
Well, there you go.
There you are.
Thank you for that. Counselor Albright.
So I think we knew when we were passing this that there might be some issues with multifamily housing. And it's just about, the issue that they're raising is just because we require a special permit if you want to do something different. Is that right?
Yeah, so there, and, you know, I think we agree with Councilor Wright's points as well. However, I do appreciate that they are really digging into the zoning, rather than purely looking at the number to make sure that it's realistic.
Yeah.
And they know people will provide parking.
Yeah.
And in these buildings, it's typically underground. It is a little frustrating that we were told all of these, you know, all these things along the way and it couldn't count into the model. That said, yes, that they realize that these sorts of buildings are probably gonna have underground parking and most likely are going to exceed that 4 feet at some point by the time you get down to the garage entrance. And then that requires a special permit, so it's no longer realistically by right.
Yeah, I'm actually heartened by the fact that they really dug into our
Same.
zoning. And they really
Yeah.
tried to say, is this by right or not? And they found a glitch, so
Yeah.
they want us to fix it.
Yeah.
So I'm 100% behind it.
Great, thank you. Actually, Counselor Kalis and then Getz.
Yeah, Ms. Kyra, can you just clarify? So you're saying that the retaining walls are that they're building are a good thing, yet we want to loosen our oversight of them? Is that right?
So we want to allow them, so previously we only regulated them within the setback. This was generally not a problem in, you know, multifamily commercial mixed use developments. It, you know, rarely came up that there are other retaining walls. You're building out most of the lot in those cases. So the changes we made were more in response to the single, 2-family, you know, 3-4 units that are using retaining walls in numerous ways to change the grade of the lot. These are just to get down to a below grade garage is what we see for multifamily. So we want to allow that to happen without needing a special permit.
And you don't think we need to encourage that somehow? We just let it go?
What do you mean, don't encourage it? Sorry.
Well, I mean, I guess the special permit deters it.
Yeah.
So you're saying remove that special permit so hopefully they get built on their own?
Yes.
Okay. I just needed to understand that better. Okay, thank you.
And we still have the change in height that that will come into effect January 1st. And that will again provide a sort of check on these properties, which we've never seen do something crazy with retaining walls, but we do have that sort of check in how we measure height that will be that would likely prevent you from building up a bunch of walls and changing the grade dramatically on the site, because these buildings will still be subject to the new rules for measuring height.
Okay. Thank you.
Great, I've got Counselor Getz, followed by Counselor Wright and Baker again.
Okay, so I am fully in support of allowing the embedded retaining walls. Just because I feel as if, you know, in fact, if we are going to facilitate underground parking, that would be the way to go. I'm not supportive of retaining walls, removed that requirement within the BCOD. Because I sort of started this process by looking at the amount of MRT we designated. And then I started looking at, you know, grade within Newton Center, within the Highlands, and there's the 30-foot differential, you know, in terms of like, you know, if you start looking. So I do not want to see retaining walls built to, you know, build up the lot, even though we measured from finished grade in a by right situation.
We'll measure from original grade.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct.
So
But,
you can only build up the site so much before you exceed that height limit,
right, okay.
even in MRT.
Yeah, but I am concerned, you know, because it's gonna perpetuate the idea of building up the lot. You know, just to get more, you know, build on the surface. So I'm fully supportive of the undergrounding and the embedded by right. You know, the embedded retaining walls for the underground parking, but not for allowing permitting, just generally the full removal of retaining walls.
So maybe we can look
If I
at,
may, real quick, when you say embedded, you mean below grade, right? Okay, just
Correct.
making sure.
And
Okay.
even, you know, what Counselor Wright was suggesting, you know, 1 foot away from the lot.
Yeah.
Because it just got, you know, and even as we understand, just even in terms of parking requirements, you know, we do for the adaptive reuse have half of the space requirement per unit. And then for new construction, 1 space per unit. And then I was looking at the VC2 and the VC3, and the VC3 had a requirement, you know, just in terms of one.
for lots over 20,000
Yeah.
square feet.
Yeah,
Um,
so there is the need, you
Yeah.
know, being generated by the VCOD. But what overwhelmed me was the amount of MRT.
Yeah, so we can look at Councilor Wright's suggestion to somehow tie it to underground parking. Because I don't expect to see underground parking in MRT. I think they're too small of buildings, and sites to do underground parking typically. Where the little we're seeing so far tends to be surface parking. And we would still retain the requirement for the special permit over 4 feet within the setback. So we're proposing to sort of revert back to that. So there would still be that regulation, but we can look at if there's a way to tie it to access to underground parking.
Yeah, and then lastly, I was looking at the denial of the engineering permit, you know, the engineering plan for the Chase for 4749. And it was flagged all over the place. And I really appreciated his comments on the actual document where he went into the retaining walls themselves were counterproductive to what we were going, you know, in terms of the natural contours of the land and water flow.
Yeah.
And I thought that, and I was hoping with our work on the retaining walls that we were getting away from this issue of, you know, altering the topography.
Well, and they fall under the rules we have today that are, you know, a special permit for over 4 feet anywhere on the site. You know, we're still going to see retaining walls under that, but to your point, I think the engineering department does a really good job of
An
taking a
excellent
very
job.
close look at
Yeah.
that and how the site will actually work.
Yeah.
Even on by right projects.
Right, and it's important for us to keep moving in the direction of minimizing the changes to topography.
Great, thank you. So I believe I'm back to Counselor Wright, followed by Counselor Baker.
Yep, so the thing is with the retaining walls, again, is MRT, we allow, I think, 40 feet, which is, you know, right now we allow 36, which is kind of, for many houses, that's even taller than what it is. But when you go into VC2 and VC3, the heights for the number of stories is like 50% taller than our present buildings. So if you're allowing the retaining walls in there, that's going to even though the overall is still up there, the maximum, it is so high and looming over everything that I would like not to have retaining walls on the surface, but for underground parking. Thank you.
So again, we're back to the idea of tying it to underground parking. Okay. That was for my own edification. Counselor Baker?
So the question I have is whether we should hold the item until we've gotten clarifying language and then advertise it, as the committee seems to be moving in the direction of a more limited, but still improving the circumstances for the MBTA purposes. as opposed to sending it to public hearing in the current form. That's a question procedurally I have.
Yeah, we can come up with language prior to noticing the public hearing, and we can work with the law department to create language that's more narrowly focused based on this conversation. If possible, I'd like to move this along just because it is one of the things holding up our MBTA compliance.
If Mr. Lee has his hand up, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Councilor Baker. I just wanted to echo what Ms. Kyra was saying, that with regards to making sure that, again, just like with the dormers, that the public hearing language is broad enough that you can have the discussion of allowing it as proposed, but also if you wanted to modify it after the course of the public hearing and whatever testimony you get through that process, that's also acceptable.
So I think I would, just to follow up, if you can work on the language to craft it so that at least the public hearing notice indicates preference for underground parking and perhaps other circumstances, but not necessarily the wholesale change. But I think that would get us closer to where we ought to be to start and then I'd be happy to see it go to public hearing if you and the planning department think you can do that.
We'll be sure to do that.
Okay.
I mean, even, we have to have it noticed, what, by the 1st effectively of November, I think? We will be meeting again, ZAP, before that. So I mean, we could,
Yes,
I think.
it's just timing on sending it to the newspaper for publication. That would have to happen before our next ZAP meeting.
But we can develop language in time for
I
that,
know,
yeah.
okay.
So I do need a motion to
Why?
set the public hearing that.
In a moment, yeah, because I do have just a couple of quick questions. And it might just be the examples that were available when you put the slides together. But aren't all of those projects special permit for other reasons?
They are,
Anyway.
because right now, the only place you can generally build more than 2 units by right is in the village center zoning, and we have not seen a larger project come through yet.
Okay.
There are some, we don't see it much, but there are some limited instances in the business zones if you're building
Sure.
mixed use, commercial on the ground floor and a residential above. I think it's probably cleanest to tie it to building type, to tie it to multifamily and above, or multifamily and commercial, and tie it to parking based on this conversation. But yes, generally those also needed special permits. And that may still be the case, that something is in for a special permit that,
Right,
would fall under this exemption.
right, and I'll just echo some of the thoughts I've heard already. I do think that the below grade retaining walls, I mean, that's.
Yeah.
Every example we just looked at, or that come to mind, make all the sense in the world to exempt or to allow by right. And I do also like the idea of the idea of tying it perhaps to underground parking, which really, it's a little bit of suspenders and a belt, I think, but we seem to be fairly fond of that kind of maneuver here recently. And I'd be in favor of that as well. So Councilor Baker, assuming you don't have, or take umbrance with a motion to set the public hearing for November 14th, given what we've just discussed. I think
No umbrage.
fabulous. I think it would be in order.
Yeah, so one of those examples you showed is in my ward, not very far from where I live, and you can't even see the underground parking.
Yeah.
Can't see the entrance to it even.
Yeah.
You don't notice it. So yes, I'm very much in favor of sending this to public hearing.
Great. So let's put that to a vote. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye, with umbrage.
With umbrage. Right, so we'll count that as a half of an aye and half of an abstention. But are there any nays? And only the half abstention, as just mentioned, abstention. So I believe we're, what did we say, 5.5 to 0.5?
Yeah.
6-0 on that one as well. And that item is also held and the public hearing will be set for November 14th. Yes. Thank you very much. All right, so I believe now we're taking up, sorry. I believe the next two, right, 85-24 and 41-24 are being discussed together within this next presentation. I'm not quite sure who I'm turning that over to just yet. However, these items are requests for discussion and possible amendments to enhance the preservation of existing homes, as well as amend setbacks in the MR zones to encourage preservation of existing buildings. With that said, I'll turn it over to planning and development again, but I assume we're going to be talking or hearing from UTL and or Landwise.
Yes, and just to introduce who else we have with us tonight. We have Nora Mazel, our planning associate for the planning department. And then joining us in the room is John Trementozzi from Landwise Consultants. And then online, we have Tim Love and Lauren Rapport from UTL. Oh, and I see Amy Fader from Landwise as well online. So we've got the full team here. And let me just share my presentation. I'm going to kick things off and then you're going to hear from most of us tonight.
If
I have
may,
a quick question.
if I may, just before we get rolling, there's going to be a lot of content here.
Yes.
Do we want to like pause at a couple of different places for questions, or is that the better way to roll through this, or you tell me, but it does seem to me that works fairly well.
I'll leave it up to you. It may be helpful if we can at least go through each section. It's essentially 3 sections.
Right.
So if we can go through each section before pausing for questions.
I think that makes sense. Counselor Wright, I didn't mean to interrupt, but go ahead.
Oh, that was my question too. I'd like to go through each section and then stop for questions because getting those answered will help for the later sections.
Great,
And
thank you.
I apologize, there's something going on with my computer. I can't put it in full screen view, but hopefully you can see it well enough. So we're here tonight to follow up on our residential district zoning review, focusing a bit more on economics tonight. So we're going to start with a citywide tear down analysis. This is some additional data analysis that we've done comparing tear downs versus non-tear down sales. Then we're going to talk a bit about how residential properties fit into sort of the big picture for city finances. And then we'll have Landwise talk through the case studies that they've done, focusing more on pro formas, as well as the research they've done talking to builders. And I apologize, the numbering appears to be off here. These are not all number 1.
It'll
all
be interesting
equally-
later, so.
They're all equally first important. So just briefly revisit why we're here. So we've been looking at trends in new development in residential neighborhoods, trying to understand the factors that lead to a tear down, and then looking at what gets built in its place. And we've been looking at issues related to zoning, non-zoning regulations, market-related pressures that impact these decisions. So last meeting on this topic, we focused more on form and sort of the zoning factors at play and how the form changed, before and after property was redeveloped. Tonight, we're going to focus a bit more on, some more data there, but then also on the economic side of things. And so just to sort of show where we are in the big picture, right now, we're still sort of analyzing the existing regulations and factors and trends. And then our goal is to share some draft recommendations by the end of this year. And now I'm going to hand it over to Nora, who's going to go into some more detail on our data analysis.
Great, thank you. So as Jen mentioned, we were continuing our analysis of tear downs and next slide. In order to do so, we compared characteristics of homes that were permitted for demolition with those that were maintained. More specifically, we pulled data on single and 2-unit homes sold in a 5-year period between 2017 and 2022. To ensure that we had an apples to apples comparison, only homes built before 1987 were analyzed because none of the homes sold and permitted for demolition were built after 1986. Ultimately, our goal was to find out if any quantifiable patterns arose in regard to which characteristics might make a home more likely to be demolished for a sale. And first we looked at marketable finished area, which includes living space, finished attic space, finished basements, and attached garages. And on average, we found that homes that were permitted for demolition had smaller marketable finished area than homes that were maintained. We also found that they were built on larger lots, resulting in a smaller marketable finished floor area ratio. On average, that was 0.1 less than homes that were not demolished. And here you can see that floor area ratio of maintained, so not demolished homes expressed as a distribution frequency. And you can see the peak here for the FAR is 0.25 to 0.3. And when you compare that with the frequency distribution of homes that were demolished, you can see that peak moves right over to the left to 0.15 and 0.25. So that floor area ratio was smaller. Another trend was that maintained homes were more often built earlier in the 1900s, peaking in the 1930s. While homes permitted for demolition were more often built after the 1940s, with that distribution peak in the 1960s. So now I'll turn it over to Lauren for a refresher on how some of these trends are visible in the previously presented case studies, and also the circumstances which make certain areas more likely to see deviation from these averages.
Thank you, Nora, and hello, everyone. But we've made a couple edits per a request from the last time we presented so that you can see the existing home and the homes that replaced them side by side so that we could understand those changes a little bit more clearly. So as a quick recap, when we were choosing our case studies, we really were looking all throughout Newton and trying to understand which ones would best represent the characteristics that we're most often seeing. So we were looking primarily at homes that were representative of the trends we see in the single residence districts. So we chose 3 case studies that are single residence. Likewise, we looked at case studies that were exemplary for what we're seeing in the multi-residence districts. And the 6 case studies that we landed on are, all over the map. As you can see, this is a phenomenon that's happening all over Newton. And represent a variety of different lot sizes, building sizes, but generally picking up on some of the trends that Nora mentioned, and I'll be going into that in a little further detail. So this is a case study that's in Oak Hill. It's a single residence 1 district. Looking at the before and after, you can see that, as Nora explained, this is pretty typical of what we see in the single residence districts. This was a home that was built in 1960, so matching up with a theme that we've noticed of homes typically being demolished if they were post-war as one characteristic. And you can see that what we placed it is much larger. It's got a wide 3-door garage, 2 times more previous living space. But it keeps the same kind of build out width along the facade. And so we'll be going through some of the dimensional qualities that we think are most worthy of noting and that make the most impact in these changes. And so on this comparison slide, you can really see the difference, and you'll note this as we go throughout the presentation. The red outline on the plan on the right is the existing property that was torn down, and in blue you can see the new construction that replaced it. So you can clearly see here that The marketable finished FAR and the marketable finished area are much larger than what preceded it. You can also see that the new construction is closer to the front setback, so it presents larger when you are experiencing it from the street, certainly with that reduced setback. It's maintaining the same facade build out width. And you'll also notice it was big difference going from 1.5 million sale in 2019 and then, sold afterward for 4.5 million just a year later. So we can go to next slide. So here's our second single residence district. This one's in Waubun. You'll notice the existing home was an elevated 1-story. It had an existing retaining wall and a pretty large front setback. This was also following our trend of home that's built in the 1960s. And the building that replaced it, you can see following our trend, much larger. This time it's a little bit over 4 times more than the previous living space. And you can also see what they were doing to regrade the site in order to allow for more height. Again, as has been explained, this is before the recent zoning change, so this wouldn't be allowed to happen today. We can go to the next slide. So again, when you compare the previous footprint of the existing home and the new construction, you can see how much wider that is on the site. You can also see the footprint is clearly much larger. So we're going from a marketable finished FAR of 0.11 to a marketable finished FAR of 0.47. And again, you'll notice these are following the trends that we've seen where the marketable finished FAR for a tear down is 0.15 or less, give or take. So this is kind of following what we're noticing. So this is our last single residence case study. This is an SR3 district in Oak Hill Park. This is a corner lot. It's got a pretty wide frontage at 130 feet. You can see it's got some pretty large setbacks, but the existing home was considerably small considering how large the lot was. That's also a pattern that we see with tear downs. These really tend to be homes that are small, but on large lots. So following our trend, this is a post-war home built in 1950. You can see what replaced it is much larger. This time it's really going deep into this site, so you can see how much longer it is, and going from a marketable finished FAR of 0.15 to 0.61. That's really maxing out its footprint there. And then now we're heading into our multi-residence districts. One thing I want to call out about the difference we see when we go into the MR district case studies is that these homes tend to be older. That tracks with what we know of MR districts, that they themselves are older than some of the SR ones. So the homes are older, but they're also narrower. So you can see that this is much narrower than the previous case studies that we were seeing. So this 2-unit home was built in 1900 and it was replaced with another 2-unit home. But you can see how much bigger it is. It's 3.7 times more previous living area than and what came before it. And you can see what was there before. And I think this comparison really kind of brings that home. You can see that difference pretty clearly in the overlay. So with this one, we went from 0.17 marketable finished FAR to 0.64. So that's a pretty big difference. And on this one, we're in Nonantum now. This is an MR2 district. You can see this is kind of a narrow lot. That's another thing that we notice as a difference between our MR case studies and our single residence case studies. These tend to be narrower lots. And you can see this was a home that was previously built in 1927 and it was replaced in 2020 with a bigger home. But you notice the facade build outs actually pretty similar to what came before it. So what they're doing is they're going deeper into the site. So you can see how deep into the plan that they're going with the new build. So they're going from 0.20 for the marketable finished FAR to 0.93, which is a pretty big difference. But again, they're making up most of that by extending deeper into the site. And then this is our last case study. So this one is in Upper Falls. You'll notice it's also a pretty narrow lot. So the frontage of the existing home was narrow. And this is a much older home, given that it was built in 1860. And it was replaced by a 2-unit home in 2020 that interestingly has a very similar facade build out width. But when you go to the next slide, you'll notice this one goes much deeper into the site. So it presents almost as the same when you're standing on the street, but given how deep they were able to go into the site, that's really where they're making up the bulk of this new building. So you're going from a marketable finished FAR of 0.16 to 0.89, which is again a pretty big difference, but given the constraint of the narrowness of the lot, they're going deeper in order to get in order to make up that area. So I think that's one of the big differences that we're seeing that maybe can be a dimensional control we can play with going forward. But I think if we go to the next slide, kind of just recapping some of the trends that we see, the demolished homes, generally speaking, tend to be smaller, as we saw. They're on larger lots and generally built post-World War II. Again, there were some exceptions on the MR districts that we were going through, but by and large, these were the trends we're seeing. And another thing we'll mention also is the teardowns tend to happen for every 10% of home sales. So this is the trend that we're noticing generally citywide. And I'll pass it back to the city team.
And that's the end of that section.
Right. Okay, so the end of the second section 1, right?
Yes.
So I see we've got Councilor Wright, your hand is up.
So I have a few questions on, and starting with page 10, I don't know if you want to follow along. What is your definition of marketable finished area?
Should be right at the bottom of that slide.
Sorry, page 10.
Oh, that was in 10. I'm sorry. I was 1 or 2 before that. 1 before. Keep going. There. So what is the definition of marketable finish area?
It's small at the bottom there. It's the living space, finished attic, finished basement, and attached garage. Those are all columns in the assessor's database, and so that's how we do the data.
Okay. What would be interesting to know is, so 10%, we have about 10% tear down. What Brookline and Cambridge would be, because they're a pretty built out community. I don't know if they have a similar number or not. On the next page, which I think is, I was looking at date. So the having FAR down here is misleading. I think it should be a percentage because it depends if you are, I think, on a SR1, SR2, SR3 lot, because what your maximum FAR is different. And so you're just kind of grouping it all together. So breaking it out as each of those type or as a percentage, they were 50% of the maximum FAR or 75%. I think that would be more helpful than just putting it all together, not knowing your data set and what lots, zone lots they are. And that's the same with the next page too.
I'll just mention on that note, these are the homes that were prior to redevelopment. So there's a good chance that a lot of these are pre-existing non-conforming and might not relate as directly with the zoning code.
And most of so we pulled out examples in the SR, in each SR and MR district, but most of our demos are single family. So while we had a couple case studies that are 2-family, that's less frequent. Most of our demolitions are single family and in SR districts.
Yeah, but because even on single family from the different districts, there is a wide range of the maximum FARs. And so it can skew it. I mean, you do an average and it really depends where that data is coming from, but that's just.
But it's not really what we're seeing is it's the relationship of the home size to the lot, not necessarily to the maximum FAR that's driving things.
But that's part of the FAR is the home size to the lot.
Yeah, and I mean, we're also using marketable finished FAR, which isn't the same as our definition of FAR. So I think I understand where you're coming from. from what you're looking for, but I don't think we can really provide that. This is just sort of showing us the trend that it tends to be smaller homes on larger lots.
Okay, okay, so we can't get into that detail. Okay, should we change our FAR definition to marketable finish FAR, which is more realistic than what we have now? Because a lot of developers just game it to get that extra space in the attic and things like that.
So I don't think we're prepared to make recommendations on that tonight,
Okay,
but we're looking at everything as part of this.
I
okay,
would also say this was partially a function of what's available on the assessor's database, so something like living space is a bit of a nebulous term, which might be a little bit tricky.
okay. And just on 197 Baldplate Road, they did they brought the house much closer to the street. Were the other homes on the street similar to what was there originally, the house, so that this one kind of sticks out, even though it's part of what setback is allowed? It's brought in a lot closer compared to the other houses?
So Baldpate Hill is an interesting one where you are starting to see that change. I think it was pretty relatively intact mid-century, that were all pretty similar homes. You're starting to see the redevelopment there. There's been a number of them. So it's changing. But there are quite a few that are that similar mid-century style, I think set a similar distance from the street.
Okay, okay, I think that's
I
it.
think you have a resident
Yeah, I
of
was gonna say, I
Baldpate
don't know,
Hill.
but,
Oh, yeah, Rick is there, but it would be interesting to find out what percentage of tear downs Brookline and Cambridge have. I don't know if that's just a quick phone call,
Yeah.
some built out cities, if they have a similar issue or not. And if they don't, what do they do not to have it or something like that? Okay, that's it for me for right now. Thank you.
thank you, Counselor. Counselor Lipoff, I don't know if you were raising your hand to kind of address the Baldpate kind of.
Yeah, I thought I'd help out on that. Yeah, that setback's pretty much similar to most of the homes on Baldpate. With the outside rim, obviously you get terrain dip, going down quite drastically. So they're often closer to the street. Most of the lots are between 22 and 25,000 square feet. So when you look at this lot and you see the home that was there before and the one was built, the difference in size is dramatic. But the ratio of home to lot size is not. I have a big problem with putting big houses on lots and having no backyard and 7.5 feet. And that's something that I'd love to tackle. But one of the things we'll be looking at over time is, the house that is created. If it's on a 25,000 square foot lot, it can be a much larger home. Baldpate Hill has 34 homes. I have lived in 2 different ones since 1974, and I've watched, I think, about 28 of the 34 have been redeveloped. So it's a great street for you, Pam, to go up and drive around and see the few originals, and you can see what's been built and compare it visually quite easily.
Great, thank you, sir. Counselor Baker?
I'm fascinated here about new growth on Baldpate's, and that's just a general comment. But I appreciate the analysis that's been done. I think Counselor Wright is reaching at a couple of things that may be worth a little more thought as we go down to the question of what is an appropriate response to these situations. One is what the definition of our dimensional limits should be. We've redefined height, for example, by existing grade as the baseline rather than finished grade. And there may be some adjustments if we get to what goes into FAR at some point. So I just want to pick up on her point on that score. And then the other one, which the case studies really may not show because they are single lots, is the context. And that's the issue about how they fit compared to the other properties in the neighborhood. And that's one of the things that I think we hear from residents, which is this a resulting building out of scale to what was there before? So I'm not sure we have yet a vehicle for accounting for context when we do the case studies because they're isolated. But I do think as you go forward on this, a little analysis to the right or left, and there was a little bit of that when you talked about the building that went back a great deal compared to what it appeared to from the street. And so I think the context conversation may still be before us, but I hope that the UTIL and the planning department will take a look at your case studies just to see if there's anything that comes up in the context that is worth flagging as well as the individual lot. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Councilor Getz?
So two things, thank you to the person that superimposed the, great, because it actually really helps to understand the relationship of the house to the, the lot as well as, just, the house placement on the lot as well as, the build out of the new. I really appreciate reading and seeing the marketable finished area as well as the finished FAR, because I think that's actually what the numbers that we need to be looking at. But I also would appreciate knowing, what the FAR is for that specific zone. So that's yet another reference point that's in this, tabulation in this one page. I am completely on the page of, looking at the definition of FAR, because I think it needs to include all habitable space. We are actually, in a situation where we're driving up the market and we're actually creating a circumstance where houses are so much more expensive because of this not counted FAR. And I think it's a real driver for demolition, because they can recoup quite a bit of additional housing on the lot. But yet there's no consequences, they just simply, the word is game, but the unfinished basements or the finished basements and then the finished attics that are below, what is counting for FAR. And then lastly, I think context, which Councilor Baker was mentioning, because I do think that we're starting to do our historical surveys. And they're relatively intact 60s neighborhoods that we need to sort of focus on, because these are potentially the sources, especially for David Kalis, for Councilor Kalis, there are ones that are over by Countryside that are relatively intact now, and there's strong push and desire to keep them that way. And they could potentially be pockets of affordability.
And we've surveyed quite a bit so far. We're in in a new round. We have a new grant. And we have surveyed a good bit so far.
Because it would be wonderful.
Working on more, yeah.
To sort of,
In the mid-century.
Yeah.
Survey.
because we're lucky to have them.
Fantastic. All right, I think we're ready for the third section 1.
Yes.
Section 1.3. Q something. Thank you.
So before we jump into the finances at the property level, this next section shows at a high level the relationship between new growth and the city's finances. I'm aware that you all received a presentation from the mayor and chief financial officer on Monday, so I will go through this briefly. But the overall takeaway as it relates to our work here today is that property taxes comprise a majority of Newton's annual revenue. And because of this, as well as legal limits on taxing, new residential growth is a significant portion of the annual revenue increases necessary to maintain services. More specifically, property taxes are the source of 83% of the city's revenue. And of this 83%, almost 75% comes from single and two-family homes. Additionally, on average, 1.4% or between $5 and roughly $6 million of revenue is attributed to property taxes from new growth. And while this might seem small on the surface, when considering Prop 2.5, which limits annual property tax increases, this revenue from new growth becomes a significant portion of the annual increases which compound year over year. Here you can see our growth in the context of surrounding municipalities. So this begins to answer Councillor Wright's question about Brookline, but we'll definitely dig into the specifically tear down side in the future. And the growth in Newton also brings in revenue through building permits, with single and two family permit revenue totaling 4.22 million in FY '24. So ultimately, because of the combined revenue streams of the redevelopment, property taxes, and building permit fees, residential development has a strong tie to the city's fiscal health and has become integral in the maintenance of existing levels of service as the costs of providing services continues to increase over time. And I will turn it over to our consultant, John Tremontosi from Landwise, for a presentation on the financial factors that shape the scale of redevelopment, unless we want to stop here for more
Yeah,
questions.
if that's okay,
Sure.
just because we said
Yeah.
we're gonna go section by section, I've got Councillor Wright.
Thank you. So going back to that pie chart, 83% property taxes, and you're saying those are single and two family, which makes up about 74%. So that means 9% is 9% condos and multifamilies?
I believe that includes mixed use and commercial, that 9% there.
The 9% or is the 17% commercial?
So 83% is property taxes.
Okay.
and I believe that's everything, all property
Okay.
taxes, and of that, the single and two family make up the majority, they're at 75%.
Okay, I get that, except the condos are not included in that 83%.
In the 75%.
In the 75, yeah, okay, so commercial, multifamily and that's a very small percentage. And then when we look, Newton is not as high in new growth, and we have Somerville, Watertown, Boston, Woburn, Needham. I think, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, they have a very high commercial base compared to Newton. And I think that's what's really driving their growth. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Newton, and I think because of that, because Newton is predominantly residential, that residential new growth becomes more important than maybe it would be in one of those communities that had such a high, commercial component and commercial new growth.
Okay, and then on the single and two unit development is a large percentage of a permit revenue. What's you said it's a large percentage. What's the largest? Is it the largest or no? Or what's the largest?
So it's, if you see here, it's about 40%. So I don't think we know exactly what is the largest, just everything else would make up 60%.
Okay,
So-
are condos included in this or not? Because they're not included in the other one where you're making that,
It's not in the 40%.
No,
okay. Okay, that's it for me, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Baker.
So I know these figures a little bit, and I think that one of the things that's important is to sort of see what the implicit lessons are. If we're talking about tear downs and then there's new construction, they're by definition new growth. But there are a number of properties in the city that are renovated that are not torn down, which also add to the new growth number. And so I think that part of the challenge is to say, okay, do we modify our rules? But are we taking a revenue reduction as a consequence of reducing the number of tear downs, or are there other things that are producing some additional revenue independent of these that this may not be as big an impact as we think. Now, it may be, but I'm not sure yet which way this will cut as we go forward. Clearly, a brand new building is all new growth, but a building that's renovated can be substantially adding to its value and to the property tax base. So I think we don't know where this comes out, but I appreciate the beginning of this, but we may need to get a little deeper into it later. Thanks.
Great, and I just, I'm gonna call on Council Albright, and then I've got one or two questions myself.
So I think it might be too soon to understand the impact of whatever we do on new growth, because we don't know what we're gonna do.
Right.
And for example, you could say you can have what you wanna do, but you have to have, you can take a one-story building, but to get the revenue you want, you could have to make, not a one-story, single family residence and make it into a 3. And you can have the same revenue by doing 3 units instead of 1. I don't know that we're ever gonna get to that point, but there's certainly many ways to cut how what we do impacts the new growth. And it's way too soon
Yes,
to understand that.
definitely.
That's all I wanted to say.
Great, and then just, a couple of questions, and I apologize, but I wrote them down by, slide number, so I don't know if I'm in the wrong section. But on, I believe it's, slide 30, there was a reference to, like, how many of these are, like, are we talking about single families going to single family? Or is this where they end up as single and 2-unit revenue? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Guessing this is what the permit was issued for, right?
which would have been what you're building to.
Yeah,
All right, okay. And then what percentage? I want to make sure, like, I don't think I saw it in here, but what percentage of the 440, I believe there were 440 properties in the universe here. And there was some number of them that would be single families that were converted to single families. How many were, because I know that in the cases, there
Yeah.
were 3, I think. 2 that went 2 to 2, 1 that went 1 to 2.
Oh, I see what you're saying. In the previous section, the comparison of the tear downs
It might have been a little
versus
bit, yeah.
maintain. That's an excellent question. We can dig into that. I don't think we have an exact
In the
number.
later section, we show what the top builders are doing, and there's a sort of.
Yeah, I definitely saw that, because and there's some really interesting info in that
Yeah.
area as well, but when I just did the back and napkin stuff,
yeah,
it was a significant portion of the 440, but far from it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
okay,
we can get that.
great, thank you. That's all I had. I appreciate that. So I think we're ready for the final section 1.
All right, well, thank you, John Pimentozzi with Landwise. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. And my colleague Amy is on the Zoom call, so she might chime in as well. So if you go to the next slide, our main sort of ask for this first piece was to talk with the building community to understand from their perspective, kind of what's motivating some of the tear down, rebuild activity, what they're thinking when they approach those projects, and maybe sharing some data and kind of thresholds that they're working with. So I'll go through that in a minute, but we wanted to provide a little bit of context and just thinking about what's happening with home sizes nationally. So on this kind of timeline here, the blue line, the blue homes are essentially the national average for new construction homes over time, right? So you can see it growing from the 50s through the 70s into the 2000s, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and essentially peaking in 2016. What's interesting is that since that time, it's actually started to shrink a little bit. And I think in 2023, again, this is nationwide, 2023, it's the smallest average that we've seen in about 13 years. And a lot of that is driven by, the affordability crisis and inflationary construction costs during the pandemic and things of that nature. So it is shrinking nationwide. I don't know if that's true for Newton. I don't think it is. The data that we're showing here, the pink home, this we pulled from one of your old reports, but essentially 2005 to 2014, showing the average new build at 4,100 square feet. And I would guess that if we sampled the more recent stuff, it's going to be even larger. So clearly that trend is not holding in an affluent suburb like Newton with great schools. And certainly there's a market for luxury buyers of these towns that hasn't gone away yet. So I just thought it was an interesting backdrop. If you go to the next slide, you guys know all these numbers better than us, but home prices in Newton have certainly increased very rapidly, particularly since about 2019, increasing about 54%. we looked at some of the data for August, where median home prices are up to 1.6 million, and that includes all home types. If you just isolate single family, it's more like 1.8 million. And again, that's median, not average. So it's a pretty eye-popping number that I think just sort of drives home the point about affordability and the challenge. Obviously, we know what's driving it. It's a desirable town, high incomes, top-rated schools, a lot of folks moving in from international locations. And then also, I think the kind of fuel added to the fire during COVID with folks wanting dedicated office space in the homes is also driving some of the sizing that we're seeing. So don't see the affordability issue abating anytime soon. If you go to the next slide. So really the thrust of what we were asked to do was talk to the builders. And so we started by looking at some of the top builders in town. The city staff provided kind of this list here of some of the top 10 builders. And you can see the number of demo permits that they've been pulling over the last 5 or 6 years, primarily going to single family, but some doing 2-family homes as well. So we interviewed the top 4 on this list with a pretty detailed over the phone interview, and you can see on the right some of the issues that we were getting into. So we wanted to know about what kind of projects they've been working on over the past few years, a little bit about how they acquire land and existing homes for tear downs. What are they looking for when they go into the market? How are they thinking about feasibility? What kind of metrics do they think about when they kind of greenlight a project and say, yeah, we're gonna go ahead and take a risk on this and look to do a new construction home? Construction costs, what kind of costs are they building to currently? The regulatory environment, what's changed recently, how they're navigating that, what are some of the challenges or opportunities that are presenting themselves? And then finally, a little bit about sort of design and market factors in this current market. You can go to the next one. So now I'm going to go through some of the kind of just summarizing some of the themes that we heard from the builders. Again, it's coming from them directly. We're summarizing it. These are things that are coming out of the interview. And the idea is that we want to understand how they're operating today, and we want to sort of model the financials of the homes that they're building today, with the thought that if policy changes, if we want to kind of tweak the policy and change the requirements, what might that do to feasibility or building activity in town? So that's going to be the second piece that we haven't done yet. So one thing that was a takeaway for me was that each property might be different, but there's definitely a general equation that they're using to pursue these projects. So it's all about the pursuit of marketable finished square footage, right? And so while they're looking at that, they're saying, okay, I know essentially what the sales price is going to be, right? The market's fairly understandable for high-end kind of single-family residential or two-family units. They understand what the sales price is going to be. And then essentially they're backing out their large costs, the cost of acquiring the site, construction cost, which is typically in the kind of $275 to $350 per square foot range, carrying costs of getting the construction loan and paying taxes during construction process, and then sales and closing costs. Backing all that out, is there enough essentially profit for them to want to pursue the project? Obviously understanding there needs to be some sort of buffer, because these things are not, they're not perfectly predictable. There's going to be some cost overruns or challenges they might not foresee. So there needs to be a little bit of a buffer there. So that's essentially how they're thinking about it. In general, they're looking for older homes on, small homes, low FAR, ideally on a large lot, but it's really more about the future marketable square footage that they can get. They're competing with other buyers in the market. And so homes that are, a little bit in disrepair, maybe it's somebody who's been living in the same home for 40, 50 years and, hasn't really updated the home and let it fall down a little bit of disrepair. Those are the homes they're looking for, right? So they really don't want to compete for homes that have been, really well cared for, where the systems have been updated and things of that nature. With the new ordinances, they're increasingly looking for flat lots and fewer trees. So that's a new thing. There was a lot of griping about the retaining wall and how sloping lots are not as favorable, but we can talk about that in a second.
If we have to.
Yeah, and then in general, you know, most of these are spec homes where, you know, the builder's taking the risk to do this. Occasionally, they already have a buyer in tow, or a buyer might come in early in the process. But in general, the builder is taking the risk on a speculative build. You can go to the next one. So clearly, the complexity of the regulatory environment has increased. There's been a handful of new ordinances enacted, as you guys know very well. In general, this means that builders are getting more selective about the sites that they're willing to engage with. Again, the ability to use a sloping site to their advantage is different. So that has, I think, fundamentally kind of altered the game and the sites they're looking at. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them have mentioned that adjacent or nearby communities are maybe slightly more attractive now, and so they're probably going to be pursuing more building there. But I don't think anybody said they're no longer going to build in Newton. And you know, I think their hope is that the ordinances will continue to be refined. I mean, we just had a conversation about retaining walls that was for multifamily, but I think their hope is that some of these things they get the general thrust of what's trying to be accomplished, but they're hoping that maybe some of the things that are a little more sticking points for them that could maybe be massaged over time. So that's their hope. You can go to the next one. One of the themes that was talked about over and over again is the time. You know, you hear about this generally in any jurisdiction where there's kind of tight regulations, but essentially they're saying it takes longer than it should, right? It takes a year to essentially get approval and a year to build. And so the point of that, their basic point is that they're willing to wait it out, but it just increases the cost even more, right? So the idea that you're carrying a construction loan for a very long period of time is certainly making it more costly. I think on the demolition delay, I don't know all the nuances of how that works, but their thought is that most of the building community are essentially, their term, waiting it out. And so it's not really changing the outcome to wait 12 months. So is there a way to go through the process essentially quicker? And if we're going to get to the same outcome, that's their words. Some thoughts about possibly streamlining the process, maybe the different departments and groups that are reviewing, doing it either in a more streamlined or overlapping fashion. And again, just the construction cost of the loan is very significant, and that's a piece that I think people forget about, and you'll see it in the numbers here in a second. Okay, you can go to the next. And I think they're saying it is important, obviously, to think about the economics and the fact that there are luxury buyers in these towns, right? So they're saying there's plenty of folks here to buy these homes. We wouldn't be building them if they weren't marketable. We're after essentially marketable square footage. But the key point there is that we asked, well, what if you could do that square footage in multiple units, right? Essentially by right, is that attractive? Does it make a difference? And most of the builders are saying, no, that's still attractive. It doesn't need to be one unit, multiple units is fine. It's the square footage that we're after. Again, they're already navigating a pretty complex regulatory environment. So they recognize that that's not going to change. Let's see what else. And then I think just on the renovations, because, you know, pushing the question of, well, why not renovate? Like, you know, what if you could renovate into multiple units if that's something that's attractive? And I think that it's a little bit more of a case by case, but a lot of them are saying not all homes are attractive to renovate either because of when they were built, there's certain limitations. There's systems challenges with some of these homes that haven't been taken care of over time. And so they're just saying, you know, not all homes are created equal in terms of renovation. So just being realistic about that. You can go to the next. Amy, anything I missed there that you want to interject? Not to put you on the spot, but if I missed anything, just chime in.
Oh, sorry. No, there's been a hand up though, if you want to take a question before you jump in.
Sure. Yeah, well, the last two slides are the numbers. So why don't we go ahead and pause and talk through any questions now?
Great. Councilor Wright?
Thank you. So about the local market, and it would just be interesting, not that I have to have it. So, you know, the price of homes in Newton has gone up 54% in the last 5 years. how much bigger have the houses become? Because it's really a factor of square feet times how big the houses are. So is that one of the big issues pushing up prices, is the size of the homes? Because that's something that, and what we'll be going through later is something that we can look at. And then the companies that you talked to, which ones were not the luxury builders?
I think they're all, I would say, quasi luxury builders. I don't think any of these are building homes that are not considered luxury.
Okay, because you said most are luxury, so I thought maybe some of them are not.
Council Oliver, can I jump in for a second?
I would love nothing more, Councilor Lipa.
Thank you. I just have to answer Councilor Wright quickly on something. Ms. Kyra, how many single-family homes do we have in the city of Newton? 20,000?
No, it's more than that. Might be around 20.
Yeah, it's about 20,000, and we have about 100 teardowns a year. The problem isn't as big as people would like to make it out to be. Think about that percentage. And Councilor Wright, you just asked the question about prices going up 54%, and you focused on the 100 teardowns. That's not what it's about. Existing homes, antiques, ranches, capes, things that have never been added onto have gone up 54% over that time. It's not just the new homes that have been built. It's every sale in the city of Newton that makes the increase of 54%. So I just want to focus everybody on that. The teardowns are 100 out of 20,000.
Well, 100 out of, it's 10% of the sales. 10% of the sales of the houses.
That's fine. It's 100 homes coming down out of 20,000 housing stock, which is an important ratio to think about.
I think it's more important is how many are sold versus how many are torn down.
10, so 90%.
10%, yeah.
So 90% of the sales are existing housing stock that have gone up 54% overall as a group as well. Thank you.
Okay, okay, then I think, so one of the things, it's good, actually, one thing that you said today, which was good, is that talking to these developers, they don't, it seemed like they would build 3 versus 1. It wouldn't matter that much to them, which would mean, you know, they make roughly the same amount of profit, but then those 3 houses would be more attainable than that single one, which is, you know, something that we're trying to do. And then what kind of things on one of your slides, approvals could be more streamlined and overlapping. Do you have specific examples? Because something like this, we may need to get like ISD and fire. I mean, where are they, you know, where are the issues?
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to, I think, suss that out a little bit more. We didn't want to call out like specific departments, so I was muzzled on that a little bit. But I think we do, but truthfully, I think we do have to go back to the builders and ask some more detailed questions, I think, to fully understand. Is the truth.
Yeah, and I think that's something we want to look at internally as well, because we are balancing things where no department really wants to do the same review twice. So there is sort of a subsequent order to the reviews prior to issuing a building permit to ensure that each department sort of gets their chance to review and sign off before it moves along. And I know Inspectional Services is sensitive to this because they're held to a 30-day clock for issuing a permit. So they don't want to start that clock or take something in if it doesn't comply with the stormwater ordinance, or if it has a special permit, but it's not consistent and has to go back to land use, or they didn't realize they need to go through the demolition delay process. So we have things sort of staggered for a reason, but I do think it is a really good point that
Sorry.
that maybe there could be more overlap. So we're happy to look at that internally and see where we can streamline things as well.
And I think it would, for this, it would probably be helpful to have a diagram, which like we weren't able to do this point, but I think we could.
Yeah, and you know, I think they mentioned specifically Needham as maybe making some changes that streamlined the permitting process. So we want to look at that and see what they're doing there as well.
They meaning the builders.
Builders, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Counselor. I've got Counselor Baker.
So first, I think that the conversation has prompted just in the last couple of minutes, a reflection on what we can do administratively outside of the zoning changes themselves, and I think that's wise to do. One thing that I think might be important to sort of focus on as a way of understanding the thrust of some of the conversation so far has been that new construction sort of is easier to do than renovation. And but I just want to highlight that we have 4 historic districts in the city where demolition is itself very difficult. I live in Chestnut Hill, and I think I think there are 2 demolitions I recall in the 30-year history of the district. But the properties are maintained and are indeed added to and modified and as time passes, but done in a very, I think, appropriate way with the oversight of the historic district commissions. The point I'm getting at is that it would be interesting to sort of look at the historic districts, not just here but elsewhere, as they tend to be areas that are preserved more than they are demolished, and but they still are thriving. So I think there may be some learning from that experience that could transpose into the rest of the city. It doesn't mean we should have the whole city as an historic district, but I think that the choices between demolition and renovation are harder to make in an historic district, but the district still has properties that are not being run down and falling into neglect. So I think that's an important aspect to, at least for Mr. Love and Landwise to be aware of, because it is a small subset of the city, but has a different dynamic in terms of construction.
Great, thank you. All set, Counselor Baker?
And thank you, yes.
Great. Counselor Albright?
So I just wanted to ask again about the year of approval that you found out about. I know the demolition delay is a year. So
That's essentially what it's in reference to.
That's okay, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, and I think there was reference to engineering being several months. And they would like that to be shorter, but the year is specifically about the demolition.
Okay, so, I mean, we know that, we know from when we were working on the historic ordinance, that demolition delay doesn't really doesn't protect these buildings. It just takes another year to tear them down, so I'm not sure that we'd be willing to give that up, but it's something that we should probably talk about.
We agree, and we've started sort of separate from this anyway, just looking at that and looking at the data associated with that, and agree that there may be things we can do to make that more effective, to streamline for some, and maybe there's things we can do to make the demolition delay more of a disincentive for others. Because right now we're capturing a very wide net with it, and generally seeing very few that come in for full demolition not be demolished ultimately, and then they're just accounting for that in their financial, that they'll be holding it for a year.
What I'm about to say may not apply to these 4 builders that you talked about, which are probably very knowledgeable and they don't need any help, but this one man that I got involved with because of his problem with getting a special permit and then finding out he had to wait the historic year afterwards. I think that if he had known more, if he had understood what he had to do, if he had understood the historic rules, he might have designed a building that accomplished his third story and met the historic needs. So maybe there's some intervention that we can do before they get to hit the historic commission that says, this is what you want to do, this may be how you can do it. I think that there's some knowledge that we can impart to our citizens that might make preservation of these houses possible. So I just wanted to put that in there. That's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, Councilor Katz.
I actually appreciate the conversations that you're having with the developers, because we're not privy to this knowledge, you know, and I think it's really important to understand their motivation and, you know, what they see as problematic, or even just to be able to interpret, you know, where they're going in terms of their overall picture. I'm actually, you know, I would appreciate when we were originally talking about all the properties to find out which of those properties went through the delay and how many, because remember originally I had asked for that, how many of them received the waiver? Because what happens normally after 4 months, they come in and they actually request the waiver and they with the submittal of plans.
Yeah.
So it's the historic commission that's actually they're looking for a bill that potentially will compensate for the loss of that property. And that's the criteria they use, and they also look at context. So after 4 months, many times the delay is waived. So I'd like to know of those ones, you know, exactly, you know, and specifically examples, which ones actually went through the full delay and which ones went through the 4-month waiver. I know of 3 properties in Woburn that it was impactful. The delay was imposed, and they actually then modified the plans and they renovated. And they actually did an adaptive, and they are, you know, they did gut renovations. So they kept the original house and then they literally did a new build. So I think that serves its purpose, because I do think it's really important for the context question, and that many of these buildings were built before zoning, and they are structurally sound. You know, it depends on which neighborhood you're in, but they are strong buildings. And then I just want to continue the conversation with the builders, because I think that we're learning quite a bit from this conversation. And I think it's important that we understand their needs and, you know, what are the issues that they're having.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, again, this is a small set that we were interviewing, but they're, I would say, a lot of them live in Newton, and I mean, they obviously are dedicated, they care about the community, and they were very forthcoming. So I think it's the door is open to continue to have conversations.
Well, that's.
So.
Can I just ask about the build? Did they mention the 4-month waiver?
A few did. Amy, do you, I know you had one conversation about the 4-month waiver that I wasn't in. Do you have any thoughts about that? I know it's a mix, like some are doing the 4-month waiver, but a number of them mentioned that they did not, but I don't remember the specific reasons.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious advantageous if they can get the waiver at 4 months, and they were thinking about that. But I did hear the sentiment that you know, the demolition delay process was not changing the outcome. You know, if these builders are involved in these projects, it's because they plan to build new homes, not to renovate. And so there's willingness to talk about the design on the, you know, of the new homes sooner rather than waiting, you know, 12 or 4 or 12 months. You know, there's willingness to talk about the new design immediately to keep things moving.
I would love to know, of the 4 that you talked to, how many of them just build that into the cost? Okay, I know I gotta wait a year, that's it.
That's the general, that was the general sentiment.
They don't want to get 4 months even, they will just.
Yeah, we've run the numbers separately on waivers, and was surprisingly low number of like things that triggered the demolition delay ordinance and had to submit an application that ultimately went for a waiver. You know, a number of them are not deemed historically significant, and then, you know, they don't move on in the process. A number of them are approved administratively and don't go to a meeting, and then of those, you know, maybe half or a little less don't have a delay put on them. So then of the ones that end up with a demolition delay, that ends up being a much smaller subset, of course. And then an even smaller subset come for the waiver. So
Yeah, so it'd be really good to understand the
Yeah, that'd be
numbers,
good.
because
Yeah.
administratively, they instantly will pull, they review and it's the commissioner, of the Newton Historical Commissioner and the senior preservation planner that go and actually decide, do you get reviewed by the commissioner or do we actually approve the demolition? And I would want to know what those numbers are.
Yeah.
In the 4-month delay, they could do a total tear down for a 4-month delay if what they're building is in context to what was there before and what's in the neighborhood. So a 4-month demo delay doesn't mean just renovation. They can take it down to the ground. But if they're building these more modern flat roof houses, they're probably going to get the full 1 year or 18-month delay.
Great. So I think we've kind of covered all of that except for a couple of questions from yours
Yeah.
truly,
I'm sorry.
right?
See,
Okay,
you made
great.
another section.
Can we just bounce over to, sorry, not the entire, yes, understood. So slide 33, I just want to understand, first off, like all the comments that are on there, I think it was, that one. So the comments there, some of them have the little asterisk one or the notes, right? But I'm wondering, are all of these basically the sentiment from the builders at this point? Because I'm
On this line?
This is
Yeah.
just market data.
Market data, so this comes from Redfin, and then we had some data from the assessor as well. So this is just market data. This is just sort of like putting the Newton market in context. This is not from the builders.
Yeah, and you might hear higher average sale prices, and that's because there's significant outliers that, drive the average up. So if you hear the average is 2 million, right, that's the average, and the median's more typical way to look at it.
The assessor mentioned that, and I think it was last month, there were a number of homes that were 8, 9, 10 million.
yeah, there's one, there's one on the market right now for 10.
But, that's not my house.
I need to go buy that.
Yeah, right. So I am curious, the last two comments, appealing suburban location, top rated schools. Not that I'm arguing with it, but I'm curious, where did that come from?
That is a little bit more quoting the builders. So we were asking who they were, seeing as buyers for their homes, and they were saying it's really upsizers moving out of other areas, potentially coming from, the Seaport, the South End. They want more space. International buyers, locating to the Boston area from another country. That's more quotes from the builders.
Is that the same for that last quote, buyers are upsizing from Boston neighborhoods?
Yeah.
All right, that, I kind of assumed it was closer to that, but, perfect. I just wanted to make sure I knew the source of those.
Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. So moving on to section 2, I believe.
Yeah, so real quick, so part of our charge is to try to set up some kind of high level performers on, the economics of some of these projects. And so again, the point is to understand what's happening, but then moving forward, right, if we start to modify things and builders have a different set of regulations to work with, what might that look like, and is that still attractive? So what we've done so far is in talking to the builders and then looking at the case studies. This first one I'm putting up here is essentially a sample. So this could be a typical full tear down, single family rebuild, 7,000 square foot. It's similar to probably the 2 earlier case studies, but it's just a sample. This is not a real property, just to give you a sense of the different line items that go into this. And so the way that we think about it is essentially the marketable square footage selling somewhere in the kind of the 600 to maybe as high as $700 a square foot. So in this case, $4.5 million home is pretty typical. And then you can see the different line items that we build into the budget. So I mentioned some of the numbers at the beginning, but essentially somewhere around $275, $300 a square foot for construction, building in a 5.5% kind of commission and closing cost line item, construction loan and tax carry kind of stuff, demolition cost, 1.5 to 3 years of taxes on it's essentially on the existing property, right? Because it hasn't been reassessed. Permit or impact fees, and then kind of totaling all those costs and backing it out, you come up with essentially what's a builder profit, right? So there's a couple ways to think about builder profit. We're showing it here as a percentage of the selling price, so it's around 7%. Some folks also think of it as kind of a markup on the construction. So you might hear, you know, a 20% builder markup on the construction cost. It's fairly similar. There's different ways of expressing it. But so that's, I mean, we're putting this from the builder's perspective of, okay, here's what I'm going to sell for. Here are my rough costs. Is there enough there to make this attractive? And remember, it's a 2-year process. It's capital intensive. It is somewhat risky. I would say probably less risky in Newton than maybe some other places, but there is risk involved. So that's how they're thinking of it. So we just wanted to put that out as kind of a sample, a little mini pro forma. And then if you go to the next slide, we attempted to basically put numbers on the 6 different case studies. These are very much estimates. So the top half of it, the revenue numbers are real. Those are the sale prices. But the bottom half are estimates based on the interviews and any kind of available data. So these should be taken with a grain of salt, but essentially this is what it could have looked like to them. You know, the relationship between construction costs and sold per square foot costs, you know, there's a real relationship there. So what's interesting here is that the numbers change very dramatically between 2019 and 2022, as we saw in the earlier data, right? So back then you could get a home in the $400 per square foot range. Now we're you know, 600 and up. So just to give folks a sense for what builders might be, what kind of calculations they might be doing when they're looking at these projects. So that's where we are now. We'll, like I said, we'll run future scenarios on you know, demonstration or conceptual kind of projects based on the tweaks that are recommended from this group. So I guess any questions you guys have on those?
Councilor Everett?
This is perhaps a naive question because I don't understand it as well as I should. The builder's profit is after they've paid all their staff. They've paid all the people who worked on the builders. They've paid all the people who did the demolition.
I knew somebody was going to ask that. The answer is yes, sort of. So in the construction cost will be like if they have you know labor where it's like, okay, we're doing, you know, let's say some of the roughing in of the framing, right, and that kind of stuff. Like our team's doing that. It's not a subcontractor. That's included in the construction cost. But so I would say the profit is above that, but it does pay for, say, administrative costs. If you have somebody, you know, doing invoicing in the office or something, that's not in the construction cost. That would have to come out of the profit. But typically these operations are like fairly lean, right, outside of the people that are working on staff. So I think it's mostly pure profit, but you know, there are some other administrative costs. I will also say if they have to come back and, you know, a lot of builders, the project's done, but it's not done, right? You're coming back a year or two later, doing various things, that would also not be included. It would have to come out of the profit. So that's the best way I can describe it. And I will also say, like, they don't all think about it the same way. Like, we're doing our best to make it look clean in general, but that's not always the case. So for example, on the demolition number, if you ask people what it costs to demolish a similar house, you will get 25,000, 35,000, 50,000, 60,000, you know, it's not all the same. They handle it differently. And then, you know, is that included in the construction cost? Yes, no, yes, no, you know, so it's not always consistent from builder to builder, but this is our best, I guess, estimate of how we see it working.
And the 4 you talk to, do they typically do one house, sell one a year?
No,
More than
more than that, yeah. I can't tell you the actual number, but no, most of these folks have multiple
Yeah.
houses going on.
Yeah, if you look at their average number of permits, it's about 3 per year. And so they're taking the profit and rolling it into the next project, right? Like it's a continuous cycle of kind of moving on to the next project.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Amy. The other thing that's not in here, so like, we're assuming that the acquisition of the property is kind of self-funded by the builder. They're not getting a loan. We're not getting a loan for that. So we're not building anything in for an acquisition loan. It's just a construction loan. Does that make sense? So if they're buying a property for $1.5 million, they're using their own sort of cash into that, and then they're going to get a construction loan to fund the $2 million construction.
Okay. Thank you.
Interesting. Councilor Ray?
Thank you. I'm having some internet problems, so I have my video off for right now. On this chart here, so the average dollars per square foot, so that's for the sale.
Yep.
And so is it location really skewing that? Because on a previous slide, construction costs, you said it's 270 to 350 dollars per square foot. And you take a look at these are ranging from 311 to 700.
Yeah, it's more a function of time. So the 275 to 350, we're thinking of that more as like today in 2024. These case studies are backward looking and some of them are pretty old, like 2019. So the market has shifted very dramatically in the ensuing 5 years. So there might be some locational differences based on neighborhood, but it's mostly a function of time. The market in 2019 was very different than it is today. Does that make sense?
Counselor Wright, yeah.
Yeah, I froze. I didn't hear the last of it. I'm gonna go on my phone just in case. I'm in a hotel right now, so their internet's not.
Yeah, I was just saying it's mostly a function of when those occurred. The market has increased, 50% since 2019. So that's mostly what's driving that.
Okay, but the 2021 at 695 versus the 2020 at 330.
Yeah, I would say the 2021, I don't know, I don't know that particular property that would have been a very high price per square foot at that time. I don't know. But that's similar to
versus a single family with size of time.
That's similar like what we're seeing now, I would say. More than.
Okay, thank you.
Counselor Getz.
Well, I actually want to defer to Councilor
Oh,
Lipoff.
sorry,
There, no, because he's gonna inform us.
Counselor Lipoff.
I just, I don't know if this is important to the conversation, but this is what I do for a living. I own a real estate appraisal company and consulting. My specialty is doing development, feasibility studies, and the appraisal. So the banks hire me and they say, here's the house that's going to be built. Here's the budget. Here are the specs. This is what they're paying. Do the appraisal, give us the as-is value and the per completion value. So we are handed the real numbers from the developers. So I don't know where you got these numbers, but those profits of less than 8% are totally unrealistic. The pro formas that come into the banks are at 15, sometimes 20%. Nobody's building and taking a risk on a $4.5 million home for $352,000. And when the market is booming at the beginning of a stretch, we've seen developers making 20 to 35%, hitting home runs, finding just the right person coming from a foreign nation that pays a premium for a brand new home. That home, there's a home on my street that somebody just bought from another country almost a year ago, and they have not moved into it. They've just planted the money in the ground. And I have a problem with that as well for another time, and there's nothing we can do. That's just what people do sometimes. But the numbers on that house would skew this whole thing that we're looking at. A bank would not take a development deal and lend on it at 7%. So I don't know if that matters to what we're talking about, but and I don't know where you got these numbers.
They're from the builders.
Yeah, well, I think they're probably building a lot of meat into the construction costs.
Yeah, the construction costs, but
yeah, and what they're doing is
that's what they do when they assess feasibility on a project. So these are not, like I said, these are not the actual finished numbers, but this is like thinking about feasibility. And this is where we get the numbers from. So if you have better numbers, we're happy to look at them, but this is the best that we can come up with from interviews.
Yeah, unfortunately, that would be breaking confidentiality if I gave you actual numbers from clients. But I'm just letting you know it's 15%, it's not 8%, and they're probably building in the numbers and hiding it, and because they don't want to show you how much money that they're actually making. I don't know if that really matters to what we're talking about, but I'm looking at numbers and I just have to speak up when I say that if you guys really want to know what the profit is, 15% is probably.
When you say 15%, are you talking about on the construction cost or the
15% of the sale price?
it's a good business.
Yes, it is. Absolutely it is. Yeah, we can talk offline if you want a little bit more about this. But you know, it depends on what end of the market we're at. It depends where construction costs are. There's so many moving parts here. But you know, there are some things here that I recognize because I've appraised a few of these homes. But there's some things I also know that are not accurate, for whatever that's worth, guys. Thanks.
Appreciate that. And to that very point, one of the questions that I did have are how common is it for these developers to rely on banks for their financing? I'm assuming it's a very high percentage of these projects.
I mean, Rick can probably answer it better, but yeah, it's, I think everyone we talk to, that's what they said,
That's how they do it,
they're getting
right?
construction loans, yeah.
Right.
That's why I'm in business, because the banks are hiring the appraisers to analyze their lending on these projects. There are some that get quite large and that have private family offices and wealthy individuals who want to be in building but don't have the experience, and begin to fund some of the largest developers. And then they get off the banks and they are giving a lesser percentage to an individual as profit. The developer's happy they don't have to pay as high an interest rate, and the person who wants to be in the business of building that doesn't have the experience but the money is making a profit, and they're happy to be a part of it.
Rick, is it possible that because they're wanting to make their case to the bank, that they might have want to make a case that they're not as profitable as we think to us, but to the banks, they want to show, hey, we're really profitable, making 15–20%. So the numbers get skewed when they give them to the bank. Is that possible? And the opposite.
Well, no, well, you know, I can see how you would think that, and there may be some times, but often what the banks do is they rate their risk, and they'll actually take a look at 3 different levels of potential sale prices, and they'll look at a range of profitability, and that's where they're making their lending decision, and they hire an appraiser to give them the cold hard facts. So it really is based on the appraisal and the rest of the underwriting decision, the strength of the borrower.
But you're looking at estimated construction costs, because it's right.
They give us a pro forma, and they have their own estimators just to make sure that it's not out of whack.
It's not post completion though. I mean, that's still estimated before the project is done.
Right. They come forward with their own pro forma. And one of the things that they ask us is to take a look at it and to state whether we think it's reasonable or not. And we know that based on all of the projects that we appraise, and we go out when the project is done and we do a final inspection to make sure that what they say they were going to build, they've actually built. And the outcome of what the sale price was and how it matches what we made a prediction, because we're doing a hypothetical, a per completion of value a year or 2 before that house actually goes on the market. So you have to remember that we're doing the appraisal ahead of time before they build the house. Did I confuse everybody?
No, I'm just trying to understand if you see what they've actually built, what everything they've spent to actually build it.
We don't, you know what? We don't get the bills. We don't get the actual final cost. And that almost doesn't matter to us, because all that matters is that our estimation was accurate, because that's what they're lending their 70% or whatever, typically 70% loan to value.
Right, but the actual cost will impact their true profitability. And I'm not convinced that the builders always know exactly what it was.
Well, there's the definition of the risk right there. You know, I mean, and the world changes over COVID. Things changed. That pro forma they gave me wasn't accurate anymore. Right. And the value we came in at, funny enough, was probably a little less, because the desirability to move into the burbs by the time the house was done they may have been getting $200,000-300,000 more because the world changed. So there are all of those moving parts. All that matters in the end, were they able to pay back their loan when they sold the house? Did the numbers work? And listen, sometimes a builder misses it, or the market changes, and they make zero profit, but they were able to pay the bank back because the bank lent the money on the right number.
All right. I can't even fathom half of what's going on in these transactions. As I'm very fond of saying, I'm in marketing for a reason. All right. I think there's a few.
Yeah, there's one more, if you go, I have one,
You have
I just
one
have
and
one
I
more
have
slide.
one. My computer will cooperate.
So, I mean, so again, we don't know exactly where we're going next. We need to all put our heads together and think about some of the things that we want to test. But some of the things that I think emerge from the builder discussions are, this issue of market conditions and regulatory process making homes more expensive. So we already talked about maybe there's a way to look at possibly streamlining certain things in the permitting process. This idea of, we're currently the market's building larger homes for fewer people. That's not helping with the affordability issue. So maybe there's ways to kind of incentivize multi-unit, either renovation or rebuilds based on the same marketable square footage, but with multiple units, right? To get the overall price per unit down. And then finally, this idea of changing the characters of the neighborhood. Maybe there's ideas of further modifying dimensional requirements to limit massing, break up into multiple units and that kind of thing. So anyway, we're just at the very beginning, but those are some of the things that we thought about as a result of the builder discussions.
Yeah, so next steps here, we're scheduled to continue the discussion on November 14th. One of the things we want to think about, and that is sort of priorities. Are we thinking about, historic preservation? Are we thinking about cost, the cost per unit for new homes? Are we, thinking about the form and design? And one aspect we haven't really gotten into, we've sort of touched on, is just the challenges in renovations. So we've heard that it can be challenging to renovate or do a major renovation in addition versus building new. We know that's getting more challenging starting next year as codes change, particularly the specialized stretch code, the electrification. We plan to discuss that a bit at the October 28th meeting. Because Berto's on the agenda, and Josh Morris, the Commissioner of Public Buildings, is planning on attending for that discussion. And so we thought he would actually be a really good person to help us better understand the challenges in building to these new codes. Because we need to understand that if we're looking to incentivize renovations or reuse of existing buildings.
Good point. Yep. Councilor Baker.
So I appreciate the comments that have been made, and I want to fix up on a couple of things that Mr. Love was asking about, and also Ms. Kyra. I did an analysis a couple of years ago of the relative contribution of the housing stock to the city's financial situation, and this is to pick up on the question of whether you get the same return by making smaller units. The assessor data indicates that the single family house is really the major contributor by a significant margin in terms of dollars per unit compared to 2-family and 3-family and condos. So, for example, a single family was, I think, on the average of $13,000 per single family house. Condos were $7,000, I think. 2 families were $6,000 a unit, and 3s were around $5,000. So just on the fiscal impact, the division, it may have some value for other situations, is a different story in terms of the city's revenue. It may have other reasons for doing it. Second, I want to be cautious about that model also, because as Councilor Lipoff pointed out, we've got a small number. Now, I think it's an important number, but I would not want to change our single family or 2-family zoning arrangements in the city to multifamily to respond to this situation, I'd certainly be very cautious about it. We're doing some of that in the MR districts and in the village centers, but we're talking about the rest of the city, and I think it's important that we've sort of, I think we need to adjust the meal we made or the banquet we set after the end of the last term. The third thing is that part of the concern that I think all of us have heard in varying degrees from citizens and why these items are still very much in front of us is that we hear from citizens who say, gee, I'm concerned because not only is this property being replaced by a much bigger and more expensive structure, which is the gentrification issue, but there used to be what you would call buying what were the target properties that you're hearing about teardowns are what people used to think of as things that you buy and fix up. And when we bought our house many years ago, an old house, and happened to be before it was in an historic district, but we've sort of made modifications here and there and along the way, but still make it go. And I think that part of what I don't want to see lost here is especially with Mr. Morse coming in to talk about the costs of renovation, that's the cost of major renovation. What I do think we want to think about is what is the incentive structure we can create so that someone could buy one of these houses, which you've indicated as your sort of candidate pool, which are somewhat more run down, not as well maintained, maybe a little more recent build than some of the older houses. But look upon those as opportunities to renovate in a less vigorous way, but still preserve. And so that we can become, I think part of why this is important to me, at least, is that these are units that used to be, or we thought of as entry-level housing. And those entry-level, and again, in Newton, this is obviously a relative idea, are being lost to much more expensive. So when you think about these, I don't want to think, at least I'm very cautious about saying, well, the solution for teardowns is different new development rather than renovating and maintaining. And that brings me back to the historic districts. Again, I do wish Mr. Love and you too would take a look at those, because those are places where in fact properties are being maintained because they don't have an alternative. So that's it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to quickly respond to that. I think that's a really good point, and I think we can learn some things from those historic districts. However, that does kind of align with our data analysis in that those older homes are generally being maintained and maybe renovated. That's for the vast majority of those, that's what's happening today. It's the more recent builds that you're seeing be demolished, and I do think it would be a challenge to regulate our way to people preserving a small ranch on a larger lot. I think some of those are going to be demolished. So it's probably a multi-pronged approach where we need to think about how do we make it maybe even more attractive to keep some of those older homes and renovate them, and even some of the more sort of mid-century homes, maybe there's some opportunity there. But in others, I think we need to think about what ultimately gets built and what that looks like. And it may not, I don't think it's a one size fits all solution. I don't think it's making all single family, multifamily. It may be allowing for some smaller lots and subdivision. I think we're going to look at a number of different approaches. It's probably different solutions in the single residence districts versus the multi-residence. But I did just want to point out that the sort of maintenance and renovation and preservation of older homes is consistent with what we're seeing. And as far as the tax aspect, that's one piece of this. I don't think it should drive all decisions, but the numbers that you're mentioning per unit are still sort of equivalent to the single family, because if you look at it, rather than per unit per property, what the tax revenue is, I think that's a more apples to apples way to look at it, is, even if this was a single family that's contributing, using your numbers, about 13,000. And you're able to turn that into 2 units that are each 6,000, 7,000, you know, that's pretty equivalent. Or you're able to take a large lot and divide it and do 2 small homes. You know, I think we need to take into account more of the per parcel aspect when thinking about the tax revenue.
Let me just respond. I appreciate all those comments are accurate, and I think on their own sense. Again, though, I want to be cautious that we think about this in terms of, we are seeing some redevelopment, and the question is the redevelopment the best vehicle, or excuse me, the best outcome in those contexts that we're seeing? And I think that's the question you asked at the very beginning, and the answer to that is we're not sure that it is, and maybe there are better solutions, but I don't think all of them involve additional density, although a few of them might. So that's my view.
Well said, Counselor. Great, I'm gonna move to Counselor Lipoff.
Yeah, just quickly, it's going to be short because Ms. Kyra just said really what I wanted to say. And I'll define what she just said in that everything doesn't fit into the same shoebox, that we really need to look at things lot by lot, neighborhood by neighborhood, and understand that we're not going to shut down all redevelopment, and that a lot of the redevelopment that's happening are smaller homes that have that are past their usefulness, that do not fit into the market, and that will be redeveloped. So what do we do about that? It's balance. Everything is balance, and this committee has the power to fix a lot of what we don't like, and that's going to come with looking at setbacks and lot coverage, and that old pattern book that I thought was really useful to say, this neighborhood's not the same as that neighborhood. Let's create some redevelopment rules that make the new home fit in better and more reasonable. We can do this with regulations and with renewing our zoning code that we need to renew, and not try to mangle and deal with fighting the free market. We have to walk along with the free market and as you know, show our values and what we want in the city of Newton by how we decide what is rebuilt when it gets rebuilt, instead of trying to bubble wrap and save every home because $1.3 million is more naturally affordable than $3 million, but it's still not affordable to most people. So balance, reasonableness. I'd like to commend the planning department for the presentation tonight. I thought it was well thought out and excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Counselor Albright.
So I want to echo Councilor Lipoff's last statement that I think this has been a very thoughtful presentation that's really provoked a lot of good conversation. But the other thing I wanted to say is that, you know, these houses are selling for 1.4 million, something like that, and then they're being turned into $4 million houses. So we don't have any naturally affordable houses in Newton anymore. And if we want to have a starter house pile of houses in Newton for starter people to come to Newton, we're gonna have to think outside this box about how to get them, because we're not gonna get them by having them not tear down a $1.4 million house, because that's not a starter house. And we need to keep that at the top of our list. If we want starter houses, we should find a way to get them, but it's not by saving a $1.4 million house.
Yeah, I think starter homes, we really do need to think about differently. And I think this is typical of probably most communities at this point, is single family homes are not necessarily the answer to starter homes. Like we have just reached a point where it's really difficult to have a single family home that is affordable to someone starting out. You need to think differently. Condos, you know, smaller units and multi-unit buildings, that then maybe people can move on to some of these single family homes. But it just is not realistic to expect single family homes to be the solution to starter homes at this point.
Yeah, and I do think that building off of that theme, there's also we do need to start to think a little bit differently about this, because a $1.4 million starter home might be a fallacy in and of itself. But at the same time, really, in the preponderance of what we're getting now are rentals. And that might be great and fine and dandy for one pathway, but it still doesn't get us into the home ownership, right? It doesn't get us into a lot of the things that we say we value and put a high, high value on. So couldn't agree more. I do think that there is a lot of value. I really appreciate this conversation. I think that what we should be doing here is either taking a moment or jumping right into the next set of content, because there might be some additional thoughts, like in terms of, if we've just kind of listed some of the challenges or some of the things that we're gonna be wrestling with, and Councilor Lipoff said it well, echoed by Councilor Albright. There are a few things that a few of us have just kind of said, well, what about this? And how about that? And what do we think about this kind of an idea that may or may not be I don't think there are any silver bullets, period. But I do think that there are ways that we can work on saving a couple of hundred homes here, 100 there, 20 over here, 42 in Nonantum, that sort of thing. A little bit of a selfish plug there, but what do we think? Do we want to take a moment and take a breather, or do we want to just keep plowing ahead? This might be a good time to take a minute if we're gonna do it.
I welcome a break, just.
15 minutes.
Not ready to plow ahead right now.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we take a moment? We'll be back. My moment is gonna be 4 minutes long, just for giggles. 9:19.
You want to vote on this one first to hold it?
Well, no, actually, because this next item is actually part and parcel to the same conversation, and it adds in 30224, but thank you for the reminder.
Weren't these both two?
Trust me.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, so what we're jump back into this, because as much as I appreciate the break, I think in the interest of time,
Yeah.
we should move. All right, so continuing on with 8524 and adding a little flavor from 30224, which I'll read into the record, aligning zoning to proposed use in new development. It seemed to fit well with this general presentation that a few of us have kind of put together in terms of just some ideas that are based off of what we just went through. So if you want to like jump into those slides, that'd be great. Everyone can see those, I hope, or soon. Are they up there? Yeah, there we go. Okay. So we'll go through these relatively quickly, so if we can go to the next one. So I think we just talked about a lot of this, but the ideas that we are talking about here are intended to achieve like increasing the diversity of our housing stock, you know, the elusive starter homes or the more attainable housing options, increasing production, perhaps even just slightly, to better address the housing needs that we all know that we have, to provide more of a focus, if you will, on climate change and our resiliency by maintaining increasing open space standards and maintaining and perhaps even growing our existing tree canopy. Certainly, we've all heard a lot of feedback, right? How do we continue to lessen negative impacts of new build on abutters in reasonable ways? I'll add that kind of as a voiceover. And then, and I think this came up a few times earlier, how do we continue to shift some of our incentives, you know, towards the development types that we do want here in the city? And as we go to the next slide, I will add, there will be natural breaks after each one of these concepts, so we can kind of, you know, knock them around and you know, heap praise on them and so on and so forth. So we'll hold questions till each of the concepts we've run through them, at least pretty please. But we have 4 concepts, the first of which aligning zoning with its intended use. We'll talk more about each of these as we get to them. And we need to address the loss of modest sized homes to these larger single family homes, which we've just been talking about. How do we then consider incentivizing additional units permitted by right on a given lot? And then what about adaptive reuse of larger existing homes? I think all of those we kind of skirted, touched on, or talked about, probably not without, you know, complete coincidence taking place there. But if we bounce to the next slide, yeah, that one. Great, thank you. So this first concept, we're seeing that when a lot that's currently zoned for business, and we're seeing a lot of these in BU too, a lot, meaning not hundreds, but several of them, are being converted to residential only use. We need to consider that our current zoning allows a 100% residential build utilizing business zone lot standards. So there's a mouthful there, using business zoned lot standards. There are no lot coverage or open space requirements for BU lots. FAR for BU lots start at 1.0 and go all the way to 2.0 at, you know, maxing out at 3.5-story buildings. And while we have taken strides to, you know, to maintain consistency of scale in residential neighborhoods, we're going to get into at least one example where these types of builds are kind of getting in the way of that.
You must be talking about BU1, BU2 here.
Primarily BU 1 and 2, like, I don't even think I've seen a BU 3 lot where this could happen.
There aren't BU 3
So,
lots.
Well, there you go. That would be why I came up with Bubkiss when I did a search. And I think also, and this came up even earlier in our conversation tonight, many of the residential building, I call them components and standards, just are not applicable in BU, like, for example, dormers. So if we keep rolling through the slide to the next one, please. We want to consider a few different options that would happen when a building is being re-permitted, right? We're talking about redevelopment. I am not intending this, we're not intending this to be, a sweeping change that is preemptive, but this is meant to, these things are meant to happen, on the whole, when the lot is being redeveloped. So the first option would be to require the zone change to residential zoning, equivalent to abutting properties that are, that currently exist. For example, in Nonantum, when we have a BU2 lot that it butts either behind or next door or both MR2s, why don't we require that zoning, that lot to change from BU2 to MR2? Right, so that we're forcing a residential build in the middle of what is currently a neighborhood, full of residential homes. Option 2, maintain that BU2 zoning, but require the use of residential dimensional controls. Again, if the surrounding area is predominantly MR2, why don't we pick up MR2 residential controls, yet it can still retain its BU2 designation. Option 3, and this would be a little bit different here. So today, in the use tables, right, we are allowed as a city council, we're allowed to, waive the requirement for business use on the first floor. Let's just stop doing that. Let's take that ability away from ourselves. Or option 4, just modify the wording in the use table that allows residential, but modify it so that it says only above a business. They all kind of get to the same thing, but we're acknowledging that there might be other, and I think we've had the conversation this way, there are definitely places where if we start to pull on one thread, right, we end up with a real big mess and the entire sweater, so to speak, comes apart. I'm not sure which of these might achieve the intended result, but the idea, if we go to the next slide, I believe it's this next slide, got the images on it, right? So this is just one example, right? We had an existing, a single family home in an MR2 area. It is zoned BU2. When it was redeveloped, we ended up with 2 structures, each with 2 units, and they're wall to wall, right? They're lot line to lot line. They had the ability to build even more than this. There are no requirements for open space. There's no requirements for usable open space, and it literally plunked down very large structures in what was predominantly a modest sized neighborhood. I believe that this is a good example of a development type that perhaps we collectively do not want to see continuing. So this is what we're trying to stop. In other words, how do we best balance this situation, right, to incentivize what it is that we do want and still fit it into the existing neighborhood, which in this case is mostly MR2. So on the next slide, just as a point of comparison, if we look at BU2 versus MR2, you can see some very stark differences, right? Just starting with FAR, it's double in BU2 compared to MR2. So right off the bat, you've got very large structures, lots of massing happening in or abutting residential neighborhoods, right? Again, like I mentioned, open space, lot coverage. Though there are no restrictions, no requirements at all in BU2. MR2, however, they're significant. Setbacks, I don't want to read this to everyone, but setbacks basically, like, in my opinion, this is how neighbors start to feel encroached upon when we're not paying attention to setbacks. What goes on a lot when it's redeveloped is one thing. How close it gets to their neighbors, I think, is a completely different thing. That's my personal opinion on that. Right, parking, right? We have requirements with MR2 and over on the BU side of the chart here, it gets to be quite a bit different, right? And it depends on the size of the business, I believe.
The residential is the same though, 2 per unit.
The residential,
So if
the
you're building, if
residential.
you're building all residential in BU2, it's still 2 per unit.
Good, okay, there, I did not see that. There, see, there you go. I knew
Excuse
they
me.
were gonna.
Counselor Oliver, is this from planning or is this something that you put together?
This is solely mine, ours. This is not planning. This is a couple of counselors saying, hey, let's throw some ideas on the table that talk to what it is we're asking for.
Excellent. I'll give a comment when you're done. Thanks.
And hopefully that comment won't be, what are you thinking? No. And if it is, that's fair. And then obviously overall height of buildings, right, depends on which BU you're talking about, but you know, the 2.5 stories, I think, maxing out at 36 feet is really what we are trying to achieve here. I'm gonna pause there. I just said a whole lot of stuff. I don't know if, you know, Councilor Lipoff, you want to come back at me first? Yep, there, he was first with the hand, but I know, I'm sure they're gonna be others.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think this is fantastic. I think you guys did a great job laying out something that that we've noticed and that we've dealt with as chair of land use. You know, we had one in Oak Hill Park because there's a tiny little business zone down there. And we allowed for some density and some condos to be built because the business district is so small, and this was separated from it by a road, and it was surrounded by larger new single family homes, that it made sense for us to follow the business zone. But you have put forth an excellent reasoning and some pathways to do it right. And I think it's situational. Once again, everything isn't black and white. You know, you're in a dense commercial area in the middle of a block. You're going to want to, you know, keep the business and build above potentially. I think that your thoughts of the density following business is too great if it's going to be done as residential. So, you know, looking at the most adjacent residential district and following what that district is and following those rules makes a lot of sense to me. I'm very impressed with what you put together, and I think it's quite useful. Thank you.
Wow, and there, great, thank you, sir, I appreciate that. And then Councilor Albright, had your hand next.
Yeah, so I think you're looking at an issue which needs to be looked at. So it's very, I don't know about timing because we're in the middle of a lot of other things, but it's certainly something to be discussed and figured out. I mean, and it brings up other issues like where do we want to go with our business districts? Do we, you know, are they the right size? Are they for the right businesses? And if we don't need these businesses, and yet we should look at making them into residential areas. So there's a lot of good stuff to study in here. So I'm happy to take this on. I think it doesn't apply necessarily to every, I don't know, does it apply to every ward?
It was, when I looked, there were pockets where this could be going on in probably 5, I believe, of, you know, 5 areas adjacent to village centers.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's a preponderance.
The
You're gonna
biggest
see it
area-
more on the north side.
Yeah, the
Ward
biggest
1 in
area is
particular.
no Nantum,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
It's the, you know, I'll say it and then I'm gonna immediately regret it. Like the Clinton Street area, Lincoln Street, right? You know, between Adams and Crafts. In that area, you've got quite a few BU zoned lots that the use is 100% residential.
Yeah,
On those sites.
yeah, so I think
So-
it would certainly help Northampton to do this kind of work.
I
Is-
think the last slide has where a lot of the BU lots are.
Well, I actually did a little survey for the BU1s, and I found it in 6 wards.
Okay.
So, but I consider these historic zoning, you know, in the sense of like, they're BU, I was looking specifically at BU1, but I would say to you, the shop house. And, you know, when it was actually residential combined with a commercial use, so that then it's like a vestige, you know, and I'm, you know, I'm a little ahead of myself, but my thought is, well, let's continue.
Yeah, and some of them may make sense, like Adam Street, you do see some of that mixed in, there really is a mix of purely residential and some of those like shop house examples. And then others like Clinton Street, you see are just residential, but are zone business.
Yep.
We've
exactly.
got the reverse too, which, you know, not part of this, but I'd like to look at some point where we have commercial businesses that have been there for a long time, you know, predating the zoning in residential zone.
Yes.
That creates its own issues.
Right. Yeah.
So our zoning does not always match what is on the ground.
Right.
Right.
And you have to think about it and historically, you know.
Yeah, and it makes sense to come back and take a fresh look at this as well. What may have made sense many, many years ago may not be.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I
Yeah.
think it's a good outlet to delve into.
Great. Councilor Baker.
So I want to commend my colleagues for your both clarity and brevity. And I guess the question is, what next? It seems to me that what you've presented is, it seems to me a good next task for the planning department to respond to. But basically, even if you just said, let's take a look at the residential uses in these business zones, should we adjust the regulations to avoid an unintended consequence like you've indicated earlier? Because I think that you've done the homework and to get us started, but I want to see where we can go with this in an active way, you know, because it's an analysis, but until it turns into a proposal, then it's hard to do much with it. So I don't know whether the department has any response to what they might do with this discrete analysis and move with it.
Yeah, so, you know, I think it is taking it sort of case by case, because like I just said, Adam Street, I think you may want to keep options for businesses to locate there.
Totally.
But you may want to think about different rules for when it's just residential or when it's adjacent to a residential property. Like we did that in the village center zoning, right? When you're adjacent to a residential, larger setbacks, step downs, things like that. So there are things that you can build into the zoning, but still allow that flexibility for business uses. Other areas like Clinton Street, you may want to rezone to an MR zone. It may not be because right now a business could locate there by right. So no one is because it doesn't really make sense. But technically you could see commercial buildings move in by right or commercial with residential above by right. And so there are areas where that's probably does not fit the context that you may want to just change the zoning proactively to better match what's on the ground. So I think it's probably a combination of tools. I don't want to overpromise what we can do while we're in the midst of the other item and we're down a person at the moment, but I think this is certainly something, you know, we can start working on.
Well, does it need any more docket item than you have? Or can it just be a sense of the committee? that you'd like the department to look
Yeah.
into this?
As its own item.
Yeah.
And it does include possible, ordinance changes.
Yeah.
So I think
I
this
think we're
one
fine there.
could. Right, the docket item, I think, contains what we need to,
Yeah.
or what it needs to. Counselor Wright?
Yeah, so we have more ideas coming up too. This isn't the only one to address these problems. So, I think we can move on and discuss the other ones and maybe at the end, decide where we're gonna go as a whole with this.
Sure. You want to move on to concept 2 then,
Sure.
for the second concept? Yep.
Okay, so I think this is where I'm picking up the next few. So this is actually coming right off of Util's presentation about losing modest-sized homes to large single-family homes. And here are some of the things that it can lead to. And then we had some ideas on how to get developers to build more what we want, to incentivize them to build, to not build these big houses, maybe build smaller houses, maybe more of them. And so we can go to the next slide. I also want to thank Util for giving the slides ahead of time so we could study them and come up with good questions. So one of the things, one of the big complaints, and probably all the counselors get it, is a new bill goes in and they complain they're, way past the setbacks and how can they build this and stuff? And I always tell them, it's the same zoning for the past 70 years. It's just that developers up until 10 years ago just didn't build to the full width of the lots. Or, with FAR, especially a lot of these houses are within, a 10th or 10 feet of the full FAR. In the past, it hasn't been that way. So you're just seeing a lot more of it. So some things to do to not build to the maximum is, if they do a tear down, is use new lot standards. So you got bigger setbacks. And we also I think, need to define full demolition. I know New York City, they had rules and for full demolition, and then developers just left up a corner of the house. So then they can get by with the old rules. One thing that I really liked was what Lexington did, was a sliding scale adjustment for FAR. So if you tear down your house, you do a full demolition, you don't get the full FAR than what you have available now if you do a redevelopment, renovation, and add-on. And then the number 3 is the large house review, like Wellesley, which Raina's going to talk about. Next slide. So using new lot standards. So what we want to do is really limiting the massing, which is done by FAR, and also making it a little more compact. And maybe, having these requirements when the new home is a certain percentage larger than the original. So if you're just, maybe you're tearing down and adding a house close to the same size or something like that, or a little bit bigger for whatever reason, that's fine. But if it's going to be much, much larger, and again, that 30%, that's just a number thrown in there. It's something to think about from when we go to the new lot standards. Next one. So this is what Lexington did. And I just pulled some numbers. They had different numbers than ours because what they allow by right on the different lot sizes are different than ours. And again, this is something to throw in there, and, for a discussion, is decreasing the FAR for tear downs. So there's more incentive to keep the house. So, again, this is something we could do. I've been trying to talk to Lexington. I haven't gotten hold of anyone to see how it's working there. I don't know if planning has talked to them to see how it's going with their sliding scale FAR.
I don't know if Zach talked to them. I know when he did his initial research, at the beginning of this, he talked to a few communities. I'm not sure if Lexington was one of them or not.
Okay, and let's go to the next slide. So then, this is Raina's, I think, large house review.
Yep. So you can see the docket item down at the bottom, and it was discussed in 2015. But it was, I don't know, you remember, way back when. And it actually, Counselor Sangiolo had taken it pretty far, just in terms of a proposal. And so there's quite a bit of content that we can look at if we were to consider this. But if you go to the next slide, you can see the definition, and so it can also, it can be a review process of a house that meets a threshold. So that then it hits the threshold if in fact it doesn't, contextually fit. So you have a standard that's set, and Wellesley does it with square footage based on how big the house is. And then if you're a percentage over that, like 20–30% over that, then you get kicked into this review process. And, in Cohasset, it's 125% of the original bill, the original house. So there are different ways, mechanisms in order to get into the process. And it can be advisory or binding, you have those choices, but it looks specifically at, criteria and standards that look at the preservation of the existing landscape, the scale of the proposed buildings, lighting, open space, drainage, and then the actual traffic circulation of that to that site and on that site. So, I have sort of mixed feelings about this because I don't know whether or not it would actually be applicable for us because there's one-offs and there's so much data that needs to be put into the process in order to create it. Because you have to have standards established. You have to have like a whole sort of survey of all the city, in order to get to the thresholds. So it's a huge investment and I think we've missed our time point for this. And I'm hopeful of some of the other proposals that we're going and having forward, but it's something to consider. Okay.
Sorry, Councilor Lipoff, did you have a comment here?
No, keep going. I'll wait till the end.
Okay.
So there's just one more slide, right?
Yep.
Is Pam going to talk about this one?
I don't know.
This
I
is like the
don't know.
idea of.
Oh, I'm gonna do this one. So this is a kind of a different thought, and I think you needed to use this in with the other ones, like maybe the sliding scale FAR or whatever. So we're trying to move away from tearing down a small house and doing a huge McMansion. And one way to do it is we allow, and we're going to be changing our ADUs for, I think, 900 square feet by right. But let's say if a house, and as Util's data was showing, if it's a smaller house on a bigger lot, if they do adaptive reuse or I should say, keeping most of the original house, and they can add on, they could tear down the back of it or whatever, and you're kind of keeping the streetscape, that they could do by right a 1,200, and again, these are just numbers, and these are numbers that can be up for discussion, a 1,200 square foot, 1.5 story ADU by right on the lot. So that's giving, and that's incentivizing that they're going to get 2 units easily, by right. They're still going to have to meet the overall setbacks, FAR and stuff, but it's more build than what they could do if we do a sliding scale or something like that of the FAR. And this is all by right, and we're getting a smaller unit, additional smaller unit, which is hopefully it will be cheaper too. Again, I think there should be some boundaries when this can happen or not. Like I said, if it's, the original house is only half the FAR or 3/4 the FAR or whatever, and then we want to keep some of the main structure, they can still take off, the back or maybe part of the side, sort of like what we have in MRT for adaptive reuse, those kind of parameters. And then still meet all our setbacks, FAR, open space. It's breaking up the massing, so you're not having one giant house. Now you got 2 units on the lot, and one of them will probably be much smaller and more attainable. Next slide. And then the last item is with these larger houses like, you know, West Newton Hill and things like that, is allowing multiple units in that house. And again, adding on either in the back or on the side for egress and that. But I think in MRT right now, we allow up to 6, but here maybe up to 4, and that would be anywhere in the city. And we would use kind of the same parameters, the same requirements that are MRT, but up to 4 units. Next, I think we're done.
Those were the 4. Councilor Lipoff, your hand was up before, so.
Yes,
please go.
sorry, I don't know why it came down. Yep, okay, adaptive reuse. What the last slide, great stuff, all for it. Sliding scale of FAR, I just ran some numbers, it just doesn't work. You would have undersized homes on half-acre lots that would not make a lot of sense. And the whole point of floor area ratio, it's the floor area of a home to the ratio of the lot. The understanding is clear that a much larger lot deserves to have a larger house. And I'm not just saying this because I love my friend David Kalis. I love the large house review. I hope it's not hard to get done, and we should talk to Wellesley, because the problem that we're having, and this is in conjunction with what I think really needs to be done. I said it before, dimensional controls, let's get it right. So we have the characters of our neighborhood maintained by homes being fitting within the streetscape. We can do that with just dimensional controls. But if we want to say, look, we have a problem with some of these homes that are going 7.5 feet to the lot line, that have no backyards, that are looming over, you know, how do we tackle that? We absolutely can have some controls over, okay, a house that is maybe, you know, a certain size larger than the average for the street, the neighborhood, whatever it is, you've got to come in and make your case. And during that, there's a public hearing, and land use does a good job. And we could absolutely critique and make sure that that home, you know, that rises above a certain level, has some scrutiny and has some eyes on it. Now, once again, I'll say, if we can take care of our dimensional controls and get some things right, and Councilor Wright, you know, it would be kind of interesting just to say, and I don't know the law, because grandfathering lots based on 1953, I don't know what the law is behind that, but if we could simply say, hey, forget about it, you know, there's no grandfathering here, you have to adhere to what we want today. And maybe that's what we're going to be doing with our zoning, but that would really solve everything, wouldn't it? To pull things in a little bit, but it's got to be reasonable. You can't take, you know, there's rights and ownership of real estate. We've got to allow people to dictate what they want within our reasonable constraints. So anyway, there's my thoughts with everything that was just presented. There's some good stuff there. There's some things that on paper just don't scratch out for me right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Baker.
So I actually want to, he'll be surprised, I agree with a fair amount of what Councilor Lipoff had to say. Not all of it, but most of it. I think that the idea of adjusting dimensional controls is a good idea. I'm not in favor of breaking up the big houses, because that's not the problem we're trying to solve. We have some opportunities for that in the other places in the code, and also in the village center zoning. What I'm interested in is the idea that there may be some dimensional controls that are appropriate for some of these smaller houses that currently exist, so that they have an incentive to be maintained, or at least if they're rebuilt not quite as big and as imposing. I'm also not in favor of an automatic ADU. We've got an ADU ordinance we're about to take care of, and I'd rather not go down another path on that particular. But I do think some of the first things you talked about, the large house review and adjusting the dimensionals are paths that we should examine and pursue.
All set?
Yep.
Thank you, sir. Counselor Getz.
No, I was just going to, I'm supportive of large house review, but as I was saying earlier, it takes a lot of work, to establish it. And there are 4 communities around us that have it, and they've had it for a decade. So it's Wellesley, Needham, Cohasset, and Weston. So I do think there is precedence, and I think it's possible, but it's a task.
Great. Counselor Wright.
Yes, so I have a question, and maybe that's to Counselor Lipoff and Counselor Baker. So, changing dimensional components, one of them is FAR. Right now, what's limiting the size of the house on the lot is FAR. They have a lot more area to build if the FAR was even bigger, because of the setbacks and things like that. I think, yes, we need to bring it off the neighbors, especially to the side and things like that. But what really controls the size and the numbers I put there, again, were just numbers. And in Lexington's numbers are a little bit different. The biggest thing controlling the volume, the size is FAR. So why not change the FAR is because that's what we want. And that's only for tear downs. If they keep the original house, they can keep the FAR where it is now. And, add on or do whatever. Cause we want more, cause it's wasteful too, tearing down perfectly good houses. Some houses need to be torn down. The house on Craft Street by Whole Foods definitely has to be torn down. But there's other perfectly good houses that it's just such a waste to put them in a dumpster.
I would, excuse me, I guess the question is asked in part for me to respond and maybe Councilor Lipoff, but just a bit of history. We went through, you may remember FAR arose because of the problem we had of the buildings were actually being partially torn down and then massive structures built on the back of them. Remember? And then we had said, wait a minute, there's the exception that swallowed the rule here. You could do, and so we created the general pattern. There may be some adjustments in the general pattern, as you point out, that are appropriate for complete tear down. It's a tricky definitional problem, though, I will say, when you get to the question of what's complete and what's not, as you pointed out in New York, where somebody left a little bit left and then said we didn't have to play by the new rules. So, but the concept, I think, has some merit.
And I could just chime in. We should have a cup of coffee, Councilor Wright, sometime, and I'll give you the industry's take on FAR to get your head around the difference between that number you're looking at, the marketable, which is marketable by a broker, which is including, attic, basement, some garage, like the massing of the building. And then you think about how people truly live in their homes. And it's the way that appraisers appraise, which is just living area, first and second floor. It's not the basement, it's not the attic, because you're going to have a roof, you're going to have a basement that isn't seen. And it's not the garage because you don't live in your garage. There are some assessors offices that include sunrooms and breezeways and all these other things. And you've got this massive number that's so daunting. But I just ran some numbers on what would happen if you did that sliding scale, and you'll say, well, what's wrong with a 4,000 square foot house? That 4,000 square foot house is more like 2,700 square feet of livable area. Now that may be fine for you, but there's all different kinds of families and needs. And as you go on that sliding scale, the houses get really small. The FAR number looks big, but what you're living in is very different. So that's a fun little thing that I can show you sometime if you want to get together with actual examples. And so
Okay.
that's what's sticking in my mind about FAR as well.
Okay, I mean, but Lexington is doing it, and I'd like to find out more how that's working for them.
I'm intrigued as well
Right.
to know how it's working for them and to get their take on it.
Mhm.
You know, Needham is actually trying to right now go through there's a person who's advocating for changing how they define FAR. And I think that this is actually what the point that you made, Councilor Lipoff, is livable, habitable space, you know, and I think that really needs to count, you know, and it needs to be, you know, in our formula so that it's interpreted in a way that it's understood, that it's not inflating the size of the house and it's actually habitable space that we're counting.
Councilor Grant, I've always wanted to have a second number there to show, you know, the actual livable against the total FAR, just to get people's heads around what you know is truly being built.
Yeah, because I do think there's a distinction as you're making, you know, between those spaces, and I think that it's important that we don't drive bigger and bigger houses when in fact they're not lived in, you know, in terms of the proportions of the house.
Fantastic. Are we set?
Hmm.
So it does seem to me, and I'll go back to a comment from the proper chair of ZAP. I'm just keeping his seat warm tonight. It does seem to me that we do have, you know, in 30224, as well as the concepts that we just went through, they do dovetail, in my mind, to 8524 and 4124 in terms of not necessarily a, you know, problem solution kind of a setup, but kind of a little bit. And I would like to, at this point, entertain a motion to hold all three of those, because I do think we need to come back to them together, even if they're not addressed entirely every time we touch on them. I do think that they fit together. So if that makes sense, I'd love to entertain a motion to hold.
I'll give you a motion to hold, but at some point, I think we're gonna need to give the planning department some guidance. I mean, there's a lot that came up tonight and ranging from dealing with the mixture of zoning we've got in business and MR zones to, you know, large house review. It's a big bunch of stuff. At some point, we're gonna need to give them some guidance about what's a priority order and what can be waiting till next year, what we wanna do now, I think we need to give that some thought.
Not gonna argue with that at all. I think you're 100% right. I think that,
We do that.
Yeah. We're gonna have, and I do think that, just as a reminder too, the 30224 and some of these concepts did come up as an outgrowth of exactly that conversation, which is the planning at one point had asked during one of these times we had held these items, hey, help us out and kind of steer us a little bit, like show us what you're talking about. I think we've got a couple of examples of that here. I think that, you know, and I think that Councilor Lipoff touched on it before. It's like, did you come up with this stuff on your own, or did planning create these? No, this was a group of councilors kind of reacting to when we said, you know, possible amendments to enhance preservation of existing homes. Well, here you go. Here's some thinking. Prioritization, I think, is we absolutely positively need to get into that. And from my perspective, I think that's gonna be at least partially an outgrowth of where we go with the work that Landwise and UTL showed us earlier. And we'll be continuing, I think, between now and November 14th, correct? So I agree.
It might be useful if you come back to us with what do you think of the things that were listed tonight, what you could fold into the current work and what might have to wait.
Yeah, what's substantially different,
Yeah,
right? I like that.
so I'll move hold.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. All in favor of holding these three items?
Aye.
Say
Aye.
Aye.
any nays? Anyone doesn't want them held? Great, fantastic. I believe we're still 6-0.
Counselor Danberg has joined us, so it's 7-0.
Oh, fantastic. Welcome,
Does she know
Counselor.
what
Yeah, all right. So those three items are held. Our last item of the evening, 36924, requesting discussion and amendments to accessory dwelling unit ordinance. And this is based on the state's recent activity. And I'll turn it over to the planning.
Yeah, and I think our thought there was that we wouldn't get into it much tonight. We put a memo in the packet just to make sure you're aware of what's coming. We are working closely with the law department to interpret the recent update to state law regarding accessory dwelling units, and then what needs to change in our ordinance. The primary one is owner occupancy requirements. There are a few other things as well that need to be cleaned up to align. So we'll be back, I think also November 14th, is that right?
Yes.
With actual proposed amendments to that ordinance.
Great, and I believe I saw, or someone had mentioned, let's make sure that obviously when we get to that point, this probably warrants some red line and where does it go and how.
It'll be,
what comes out.
we'll do a red line, we're working on a red line of the ordinance, so we'll provide that, because it's a number of changes. So we'll have red line ordinance for that meeting.
Fantastic. All right, Councilor Baker.
So I appreciate that, and I think that's a good way to proceed. I just want to say that we went through a long process of revising this ordinance a couple of years ago. And my personal take on it is that we should try and preserve as much as we can, even, for example, if it's legitimate under state law, to preserve the idea that for units that are not specifically set out in the state legislation, that we still maintain the owner occupancy requirement. Now, maybe we can't do that, and Mr. Lee is here, and that's a conversation to be had, but I'm just saying that the state law gives, and we already had as of right units, so I think it's important to try and maintain as much of what we can in the context of an amendment. Obviously, the law will decide that, but I'm sure that we'll have that conversation a little more extensively next time, but I just want to give my own personal take on it.
Thank you, sir. Councilor Wright.
Thank you. So one thing I do want to see changed in our rules for ADU is I believe we allow the ADU in the setbacks. And I would like to see if it's an existing structure like a garage, a carriage house, you know, it's an existing structure, yes, it's okay. But if it's a new structure, I don't think it should be allowed into the setbacks. And I think our rules do allow that. So I'd like to see that change so that it's meets the setbacks.
We have, so that was the most recent update, relax the setbacks slightly from the principal setbacks. So we can provide that analysis when we come back with that.
I mean, because our side setbacks already for all the MR lots and is only 7.5 feet. So, you know, having this ADU at least 7.5 feet from the setback, that's great. And especially like with these older houses, sometimes your neighbor's house, like my house, is only 1.5 feet from you know, the lot line. So I would like to see at least keeping setbacks for the ADU. Thank you.
All set, Councilor?
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic.
So do we need to hold this?
Yes, I believe we need to hold this one as well.
So move.
Fantastic. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Fantastic. We're going to be holding that item for 7-0, I believe, start count. And believe it or not, at the early hour of 10:13 p.m., that is the last item on our agenda this evening. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. My apologies. I'm sure you'll be looking forward to getting Councilor Baker back in the chair. I wish him well in terms of the recovery in your household, sir. You have a lovely night, and thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
And thank you for filling in.
Yeah, and go look outside at the Northern
My
Lights.
neighbor,
Yeah.
she sent me a picture. I said, damn, I'm at City Hall. Couldn't see it on the way.